Chapter 16 of The Wonderful Year by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 16. The interest which Felice manifested in Madame Chauvet's conversation surprised that simple-minded lady. Madame Chauvet fully realized her responsibilities. She performed her dragonly duties with the conscientiousness of a French mother who had, and was likely to have to the end of the chapter, marriageable daughters. But commerce is commerce, and the young girl engaged in commercial management in her own house has, in France, owing to the scope required by her activities, far more freedom than her school contemporary who leads a purely domestic life, a fact recognized by the excellent Madame Chauvet as duly established in the social scheme. She was ready to allow Felice all the necessary latitude. Felice claimed scarcely any. She kept the good Madame Chauvet perpetually pinned to her skirts. She had not a confidential word to say to Martin. Now Madame Chauvet liked Martin, as did everyone in Brantôme. He was courteous, he was modest, he was sympathetic. Whatever he did was marked by an air of good breeding which the French are very quick to notice. Whether he handed her the stewed veal, or listened to the latest phase of her chronic phlebitis, Madame Chauvet always felt herself in the presence of what she termed une âme d'élite, a picked and chosen soul. He was also as gentle as a sheep. Why, therefore, Felice, in her daily intercourse with Martin, should insist on her waving the banner of the proprieties over their heads, was more than the good lady could understand. Felice was more royalist than the king, more timid than a nunnery, more white wax and rose leaves than her favourite author, Monsieur René Bazin, had ever dared to portray as human. If Martin had been 6 foot of thews and muscles, with conquering moustaches and bold and alluring eyes, she would not have hesitated to protect Felice with her Frenchwoman's little plump body and unshakable courage. But why all this precaution against the mild, grey-eyed, sallow-faced Martin, doux comme un mouton? And why this display of daughterly affection suddenly awakened after 15 years' tepid acquaintance? Even Martin, unconscious of offence, wondered at such prim behaviour. The fact remained, however, that she scarcely spoke to him during the greater part of Bigourdon's absence. But when the news came that her mother was dead and laid to rest, and she had recovered from the first overwhelming shock, she dropped all outer trappings of manner and became once more the old Felice. Madame Chauvet, knowing nothing of the dream mother, offered her unintelligent consolation. She turned instinctively to Martin, in whom she had confided. Martin was moved by her grief, and did his best to sympathize, but he wished wholeheartedly that Bigourdo had not told him the embarrassing truth. Here was the poor girl weeping her eyes out over a dead angel, whom he knew to be nothing of the kind. He upbraided himself for a sacrilegious hypocrite when he suggested that they would meet in heaven. She withdrew, however, apparently consoled. A few hours later she came to him again, in the vestibule. She had dried her eyes, and she wore the air of one who had accepted sorrow and bravely faced an unalterable situation. She showed also a puzzled little knitting of the brows. "Tell me truly, Martin," she said, "did my uncle, before he left, give you the real reason of his going to Paris?" Challenged, Martin could not lie. Yes, your mother was very ill, but he commanded me not to tell you in order to save you suffering. He didn't know. She might recover, in which case all would have been well." "So you too were dragged into this strange plot to keep me away from my mother?" "I've never heard of one, Felice," answered Martin, this time with conscience-smiting mendacity. "And my part has been quite innocent." "There has been a plot of some kind," said Felice, breaking into the more familiar French. "My uncle, my father, my aunt Clotilde have been in it, and now you, under my uncle's orders. There has been a mystery about my mother which I have never been able to understand, like the mystery of the Trinity or the Holy Sacraments. And today I understand still less. I have not seen my mother since I was 5 years old. She has not written to me for many years, although I have written regularly. Did she get my letters? These are questions I have been asking myself the last few hours. Why did my father not allow me to see her in the hospital in Paris? Why did my Aunt Clotilde always turn the mention of her name aside, and would tell me nothing about her? And now, when she died, why did they not telegraph for me to go to Paris, so as to look for one last time on her face? They knew all that was in my heart. What have they all been hiding from me?" "My poor Felice," said Martin, "how can I tell?" And how could he, seeing that he was bound in honour to keep her in ignorance? "Sometimes I think she may have had some dreadful disease that ravaged her dear features, and they wished to spare me the knowledge. But my father has always drawn me the picture of her lying beautiful, as she always was, upon the bed she could not leave." "Whatever it was," said Martin, "you may be sure that those who loved you acted for the best." "That is all very well for a child, but not for a grown woman. And it is not as I have not shown myself capable of serious responsibilities. It is heartrending," she added after a little pause, "to look into the eyes of those one loves and see in them something hidden." Sitting there sideways on the couch by Martin's side, her girlish figure bent forward and her hands nervously clasped on her knee, the oval of her pretty face lengthened despondently, her dark eyes fixed upon him in reproachful appeal, she looked at once so pathetic and so winning that for the moment he forgot the glory of Lucilla and longed to comfort her. He laid his hand on her white knuckles. "I would give anything," said he. She loosened her clasp, thus eluding his touch, and moved a little aside. Madame Chauvet appeared from the kitchen passage, bearing a steaming cup. "Ma pauvre petite," she said, "I have brought you a cup of chamomile tea. Drink it. It calms the nerves." Martin rose, and the good lady took his seat and discoursed picturesquely upon her mother's last illness, death, and funeral, until Felice, notwithstanding the calming properties of the chamomile tea, burst into tears and fled to her room. "Poor little girl," said Madame Chauvet sympathetically. "I cried just like that. I remember it as if it were yesterday." The next day Bigourda returned. He walked about expanding his chest with great draughts of air, like the good provincial who had suffocated in the capital. He railed at the atmosphere, the fever, the cold-heartedness of Paris. "One is much better here," said he, "and we have made much further progress in civilization. Even the Hotel de la Dordogne has not yet a bathroom." He was closeted long with Felice, and afterwards came to Martin great wrinkles of perturbation marking his forehead. "She has been asking me questions which it has taken all my tact and diplomacy to answer. Mon Dieu, que j'ai menti. But I have convinced her that all we have done with regard to her mother has been right. I will tell you what I have said." "You had better not," replied Martin, anxious to have no more embarrassing confidences. "The less I know, the simpler it is for me to plead ignorance when Felice questions me, not to say the more truthful." "You are right," said Bigourda. "Magna est veritas et provolabit." And as Martin, not catching the phrase as pronounced in continental fashion, looked puzzled, he repeated it. "It's Latin," he added. "Why should I not quote it? I have received a good education." Now about this time a gracious imp of meddlesomeness alighted on Lucilla's shoulder and whispered into her ear. She arose from a sea of delicate raiment and tissue paper, whose transference by Celeste into ugly trunks she and Heliogabalus were idly superintending, and, sitting down at the writing-desk of her hotel bedroom, scribbled a short letter. If she had blown the imp away, as she might easily have done, for such imps are irresponsible dragonfly kind of creatures, Martin might possibly have foregone his consultation with Fortinbras and remained at Brantôme. Felice, having once restored him to the position he occupied in her confidence, allowed him to remain there. In his thoughts she assumed a new significance. He realized in his blundering, masculine way that she was many-sided, complex, mysterious. At one turn simple and caressive as a child, at another passionate in her affections, at yet another calm and self-reliant. Altogether that she had a strangely sweet and strong personality. For the first time the alliance so subtly planned by Bigourda entered his head. If Picaudin thought him worthy to be his partner and carry on the historic tradition of the Hôtel des Grottes, surely he would look with approval on his carrying them on in conjunction with the most beloved member of his family. And Felice? There his inexperience came to a stone wall. He was modest. He did not in the least assume as a possibility that she might have already given him her heart. But he reflected that, after all, in the way of nature, maidens did marry unattractive and undeserving men, that except for an unaccountable phase of coldness, she had always bestowed on him a friendly regard, which, if courteously fostered, might develop into an affection warranting on her part a marriage with so unattractive and undeserving a man as himself. And Bigourda, great splendid-hearted fellow, claimed him, and this warm Périgord, this land of plenty and fat things, claimed him. Here lay his destiny. Why not blot out with the blackest curtain of will the refulgent figure that was making his life a torture and a dream? And then came the imp-inspired letter. Dear Mr. Overshaw, I am starting for Egypt tomorrow. I hope you will redeem your promise. With kind regards, yours sincerely, Lucilla Merriton. Paralysed, then, were the promptings towards sluggish plenitude and tepid matrimonial comfort. Love summoned him to fantastic adventure. For a while he lost mental balance. He decided to put himself in the hands of Fortinbras. He would abide loyally by his decision. Under his auspices he had already made one successful bid for happiness. By dismissing Margaret's Universal College to the limbo of irretrievable things, according to the dealer's instructions, had he not tasted during the past 5 months hundreds of the once forbidden delights of life? Was he the same man who in apologetic trepidation had written to Corinna in August? His blind faith in Fortinbras was intensified by knowledge of the suffering whereby the dealer in happiness had acquired wisdom. East or west, whichever way Fortinbras pointed, he would go. Thus, in some measure, he salved his conscience when he left Brantôme. Bigourda expected him back at the end of his fortnight's holiday. So did Felice. She packed him a little basket of food and wine, and with a smile bade him hasten back. She did not question the purport of his journey. He needed a change, a peep into the great world of Paris and London. "If you have a quarter of the good time I had, I envy you," she said. And Bigourda, with a grip of the hand and a knowing smile as they parted, whispered, "I will give that old dress suit to Anatole, the plongeur at the Café de l'Univers. He will be enchanted." The train steamed out of the station, carrying a traitorous, double-dyed villain. It arrived at Paris carrying a sleepless, anxious-eyed young man, throbbing with suspense. He drove to the Hôtel du Soleil et de l'Écosse. "Ah, monsieur has returned," said the fat and greasy Bourdin as he entered. "Evidently," replied Martin, who now had no timidities in the presence of hotel managers, and was not impressed by the professional facial memory. Was he not himself on the verge of becoming a French innkeeper? He presented a business card of the Hôtel des Grottes, mysteriously inscribed by Bigourda, and demanded a good room. The beady black eyes of the Provençal regarded him shrewdly. "Some months ago you were a professor." "It is always permissible for an honest man to change his vocation," said Martin. "Ah, that is very true," said Bourdin. "I myself make my studies as a veterinary surgeon, but as I am one of those unfortunates whom horses always kick and dogs always bite, I entered the service of my brother, Émile Bourdin, who keeps an hotel at Nîmes." "Ah, the Hôtel de la Curatterie," said Martin. "You know it!" cried Bourdin joyously. "Not personally, but it is familiar to every commis voyageur in France." His professional knowledge at once gained him the esteem and confidence of Monsieur Bourdin, and a magnificent chamber at a minimum tariff. After he had eaten and sent a message to Fortinbras at the new address given him by Bigourda, he went out into the crisp, exhilarating air, with Paris and all the universe before him. In the queer profession into which he had drifted, heaven knows how, of giving intimate counsel not only to the students, but, as his reputation spread, to the small shopkeepers and work-people of the Rive Gauche, at his invariable fee of 5 francs per consultation, Fortinbras had been able to take a detached view of human problems. In their solution he could forget the ever-frightening problem of his own existence, and find a subdued delight. Only in the case of Corinna and Martin had he posed otherwise than as an impersonal intelligence. As an experiment he had brought them into touch with his own personal concerns, and now there was the devil to pay. For consider, here he was prepared to deal out advice to Martin according to the conspiracy with which he had entered with Bigourda. Martin was to purchase an interest in the Hôtel des Grottes, and, although he knew it not, marry Felice. There could not have been a closer family arrangement. When Fortinbras rose from the frosty terrace of the Café Cardinal at the corner of the Rue Richelieu and the Boulevard des Italiens, their appointed rendezvous, and greeted Martin, there was something more than benevolence in his smile, something paternal in his handshake. They entered the café-restaurant and sat down at one of the tables not yet laid for déjeuner, for it was only 11 o'clock. Fortinbras, attired in his customary black, looked more trim, more prosperous. Collar, cuffs, and tie were of an impeccable whiteness. The silk hat which he hung with scrupulous care on the peg against the wall was startlingly new. He looked like a disguised cardinal in easy circumstances. He made bland inquiries as to the health of the good folks at Brantôme, and ordered an apéritif for Martin, and black-currant syrup and water for himself. Then Martin said, "I have come from Brantôme to consult you on a matter of the utmost importance, to myself, of course. It's a question of my whole future." He laid a 5-franc piece on the table. Fortinbras pushed the coin back. "My dear boy, this is a family affair. I know all about it. For you, I'm no longer the Marchand de Bonheur." "If you're not," said Martin, "I don't know what the devil I shall do." And with his finger he flicked the coin midway between them. "My dear fellow," said Fortinbras, flicking the coin an inch towards Martin, "if you so desire it, I will deal with you in my professional capacity. But as in the case of the solicitor or the doctor, it would be unprofessional to accept fees for the settlement of his own family affairs. So in this matter I am unable to accept a fee from you. Bigourda, whose character you have had an intimate opportunity of judging, has offered you a share in his business. As a lawyer and a man of the world, I say unhesitatingly, accept it. As long as Brantôme lasts, and there are no signs of it perishing, commercial travellers and tourists will visit it and go to the Hôtel des Grottes. And as long as European civilization lasts, it will demand the gastronomic delicacies of truffles, pâté de foie gras, Perigord pie, stuffed quails, and compote of currants, which now find their way from the fabrique of the hotel to Calcutta, Moscow, San Francisco, Bayswater, and Buenos Aires. As a Marchand de Bonheur, as you are pleased to call me, I also unhesitatingly affirm that in your acceptance you will find true happiness." He sipped his cassis and water, and leaned back on the plush-covered seat. Martin pushed the 5-franc piece 3 or 4 inches towards Fortinbras. "It isn't such a simple, straightforward matter as you seem to imagine," said Martin. "Otherwise I should have closed with Bigourda's generous offer straight away. I'm not a fool, and I'm devotedly attached to Bigourda, who for no reason that I can see, save his own goodness of heart, has treated me like a brother. I haven't come to consult you as a man of business at all, and as for conscientious scruples about Bigourda being a relative of yours, please put them away." He pushed the coin another inch. "It is solely as Marchand de Bonheur, in the greatest crisis of my life, when I'm torn to pieces by all sorts of conflicting emotions, that I wanted to consult you. There are complications you know nothing about." "Complications?" Fortinbras stretched out a benign hand. "Is it possible that there is some little, what shall we say, sentiment?" He smiled, seeing the young man's love for Felice barring his candid way. "You can be frank with me." "It's a damn sight more than sentiment," cried Martin with unprecedented explosiveness. "Read this." He dragged from his pocket a dirty, creased and crumpled letter and threw it across the table. Fortinbras adjusted his glasses and read the imp-inspired message. He took off his glasses and handed back the letter. His face became impassive, and he regarded Martin with expressionless, tired blue eyes. "Your promise? What was that?" "To go to Egypt." "Why should you go to Egypt to meet Lucille Meryton?" Martin threw up both hands in a wide gesture. "Can't you see I'm mad to go to Egypt, or Cape Horn, or hell to meet her? But I've enough sanity left to come here and consult you." Fortinbras regarded him fixedly, and nodded his head reflectively many times, and without taking his eyes off him, reached out his hand for the 5-franc piece, which he slipped into his waistcoat pocket. "That puts," said he, "an entirely different complexion on the matter." End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of The Wonderful Year by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 17. The astute conspiracy had tumbled to ruins, the keystone, Felice, being knocked out. It was no longer a family affair. Fortinbras listened to the young man's statement of his case with professional detachment. His practised wit questioned. Martin replied until he had laid bare his candid and intoxicated soul. At last Fortinbras, with a wave of his plump hand and with his benevolent smile, said, "Let us now adjourn from labour to refreshment. I will give myself a luxury I have not enjoyed for many a year. I will entertain a guest. You shall lunch with me. When our spirits are fortified and our judgments mellowed by generous food, we shall adjourn from refreshment to labour. Sometimes you can put a 5-franc piece into the slot and pull out an opinion. Sometimes you can't. Let us go to another table." They lunched. Fortinbras talked of men and things and books. He played the perfect host until the first cigarette had been smoked. Then he lay back in the upholstered seat against the wall and looked into vacancy, his face a mask. Martin, sitting by his side, dared not disturb him. He felt like one in the awe-inspiring presence of an oracle. Presently the oracle stirred, shifted his position, and resumed human semblance, the smile reappearing in his eyes and at the corner of his pursy mouth. "My dear Martin," said he, one elbow on the table and the hand caressing his white hair, "I have now fully considered the question, and see distinctly your path to happiness. As my good old friend Montaigne says, an author I once advised you to cultivate." "I've done so," said Martin. Fortinbras beamed. "There is none richer in humanity. In his words, I say, the wisdom of my instruction consists in liberty and naked truth. I take the human soul as it is and seek to strip it free from shackles and disguises. I strip yours from the shackles of gross material welfare and the travesty of content. I see it ardent in the pursuit, perhaps of the unobtainable, but at any rate in the pursuit of splendour, which is a splendid thing for the soul. Liberty and naked truth are the only watchwords. Sell out some of your capital, equip yourself in lordly raiment, go to Egypt, and give your soul a chance." "I needn't tell you," said Martin, after a pause, "that I was hoping you would give me this advice. It seems all crazy, but still—" He lit a cigarette, which, during Fortinbras's discourse, he had been holding in his fingers. "Well, there it is. I don't seem to care a hang what happens to me afterwards." "From my professional point of view," said Fortinbras, "that is an ideal state of mind. All the same, I can't help feeling a brute. What the devil can I say to Bigorna?" "You can leave that to me," replied Fortinbras. "He is aware that you are a client of mine, and not only honour me with your confidence, but are willing to be guided by my counsel. If you will accept my society, I will accompany you to the land of the Pharaohs." "What?" cried Martin, taken aback. "You? Good God! Of course," he added after recovery. "I should love you to come." "As I was saying," Fortinbras continued, "I will accompany you, take upon my shoulders your responsibilities with regard to Bigorna, and, for my own private satisfaction, realize the dream of my life, which is to go up to the Sphinx and say, 'Now, my dear creature, confidentially, as between Ugur and Ugur, what the deuce is it all about?'" Later, when Martin had accustomed himself to the amazing proposal, they discussed ways and means. "You," said Fortinbras, "in order to drink the deep draughts essential to your evolution, must peacock it with the best. You must dwell in palaces and drive in chariots. I, on the other hand, journeying as a philosopher, need but a palm tree's shade, a handful of dates, and a cup of water. I shall therefore not be of your revellings, but I shall always be near at hand, a sort of private gin, always at your distinguished service." "It's most delightful and generous of you to put it that way," laughed Martin, "but for the life of me I can't see why you should do it." Fortinbras replied simply, "I'm a very weary man, my dear boy, and my heart needs a holiday. That is why I grasped this opportunity of going into the sunshine. As to my offer of counsel, that is a matter which it would be futile to discuss." His last words were flavoured with mystery. As far as Martin was concerned, Fortinbras was free to go whithersoever he pleased. But why this solicitude as to his welfare, this self-made slave of the lamp obligation? Soon he gave up the riddle. Too many exciting thoughts swept his brain. Until it was written, the letter to Bigourda weighed on his mind. The problem confronting him was to explain his refusal without reference to Lucilla. To Fortinbras, keeper of his conscience, he could avow his splendid lunacy and be understood. To Bigourda, his English reserve forbade his writing himself down an ass and saying, "The greasy waiter cannot accept partnership with you, as he must follow to the ends of the earth the radiant lady to whom he handed the mutton cutlets." The more he tried, the less he could do it. He sat up all night over the letter. It contained all the heart of him that was left for the Hôtel des Grottes and Brantôme and Périgord. But, well, he had arranged to abide by Fortinbras's decision. Fortinbras had advised him to see more of the world before definitely settling his life. With a disingenuousness which stabbed his conscience, he threw the responsibility on Fortinbras. Fortinbras was carrying him to Egypt on an attempt to solve the riddle of the Sphinx. Bigourda knew the utter faith he had in Fortinbras. He sent his affectionate regards to everybody, and to Felice. It was the most dreadful, heart-tearing letter he had ever had to write. Meanwhile, Fortinbras, betraying for the first time in his life professional secrecy, revealed the whole matter to Bigourda in an illuminating document. And Bigourda, reading it and comparing it with Martin's letter, said "Bigre" and "Sacre bleu" and "Nom de Dieu," and all sorts of other things. At first he frowned incredulously, but on every re-perusal of the letter the frown grew fainter, until, after the fifth, the placid smile of faith overspread his broad countenance. But Felice, who was only told that Martin was not returning, but had gone to Egypt with her father, grew white and thin-lipped, and hated the day she had met Lucilla Meryton, and all the days she had spent with Lucilla Meryton, and, in a passion of tears, heaped together everything that Lucilla Meryton had ever given her, gowns and furs and underlinen and trinkets, in a big trunk, which she stowed away in an attic. And the plongeur from the Café de l'Univers was appointed waiter in Martin's stead, and strutted about proudly in Martin's cast-off raiment. He was perhaps the most carefree person in the Hôtel des Grottes. Martin went on a flying visit to London, and on the advice of Fortinbras, put up at the Savoy. "Accustom yourself to lordliness," the latter had counselled. "You can't conquer Egypt with the self-effacing humility of the servitor. By rubbing shoulders with the wealthy, you will acquire that suspicion of arrogance, the whiff of garlic in the salad, in which your present demeanour is so sadly lacking. You will also learn by observation the correct wear in socks and ties, and otherwise steep yourself in the study of indispensable vanities." Martin studied conscientiously, and when he had satisfactorily arranged his financial affairs, including the opening of a banking account with Messrs. Thomas Cook and Son, visited tailors and haberdashers and hatters and bootmakers, ordering all the things he had seen worn by the opulent youth of the Savoy Hotel. If he had stolen the money to pay for them, or if he had intended to depart with them without paying, he could not have experienced a more terrifying joy. Like a woman clothes-starved for years who had been given the run of London shops, Martin ran sartorially mad. He saw suitings, hosiery, shoes with Lucilla's eye. He bought himself a tie-pin, a thing which he had never possessed nor dreamed of possessing in his life before. And, observing that an exquisite young Lothario upon whom he resolved to model himself did not appear with the same tie-pin on 2 consecutive days, he went out and bought another. Modesty and instinctive breeding saved him from making himself a harlequin. In the midst of these preoccupations he called, by arrangement, on Corinna. She was living with another girl on the 5th floor of a liftless block of flats in Wandsworth. The living-room held 2 fairly comfortably. 3 sat at somewhat close quarters. So when Martin arrived, the third, Corinna's mate, after a perfunctory introduction, disappeared into a sort of cupboard that served her as a bedroom. Corinna looked thin and ill and drawn, and her blouse gaped at the back, and her fair hair exhibited the ropiness of neglect. The furniture of the room was of elementary flimsiness. Loose newspapers, pamphlets, handbills made it as untidy as Corinna's hair. As soon as they were alone, Martin glanced from her to her surroundings, and then back again to her. "My dear Corinna," said he, putting hat, stick, and gloves on a bamboo table, "what on earth are you doing with yourself?" She looked at him defiantly, with a touch of haggardness. "I'm devoting myself to the cause." Martin wrinkled a puzzled brow. "What cause?" "For a woman there is only one," said Corinna. "Oh," said Martin. "May I sit down?" "Please do." She poked a tiny flower in a diminutive tiled grate, while he selected the most solid of the bamboo chairs. She sat on a stool on the hearth-rug. "I suppose you're anti-suffrage like any other bigoted reactionary," she said. Martin replied truly, "I haven't worried about it one way or the other." She turned on him swiftly. "Then you're worse than a downright opponent. It's just the contemptuous apathy of men like you that drive us mad." She entered upon a long and nervous tirade, trotting out the old arguments, using the stock phrases, parroting 100 platform speeches. And all the time, though appearing to attack, she was on the defensive, defiant, desperate. Martin regarded her with a shocked expression. Her thin, blonde beauty was being pinched into shrewishness. "But, my dear Corinna," said he, "I've come to see you as an old friend. I just want to know how you're getting on. What's the good of a political argument between us two? You may be wrong or you may be right. I haven't studied the question. Let us drop it from a contentious point of view. Let us meet humanly. Or, if you like, let us tell each other the outside things that have happened to us. You haven't even asked me why I'm here. You haven't asked about Felice or Fortinbras or Bigourdin." He waxed warm. "I've just come from Brantôme. Surely you must have some grateful memories of the folks there. They treated you splendidly. Surely you must take some interest in them." Corinna supported herself on an outspread hand on the hearth-rug. "Do you want me to tell you the truth?" She held him with her pained blue eyes. "I don't take an interest in any damn thing in God's universe." "May I smoke?" said Martin. He lit a cigarette, after having offered her his case, which she waved aside impatiently. "If that is so," said he, "what in the world is the meaning of all the stuff you've just been talking?" "I thought you had the sense to have learned something about me. How otherwise am I to earn my living? We've gone over the ground 100 times. This is a way, anyhow, and it's exciting. It keeps one from thinking of anything else. I've been to prison." Martin gasped, asked her if she had thunderstruck. "I tried, but I hadn't the pluck or the hysteria. Isabel Bandage can do it." She lowered her voice and waved towards her concealed companion. "I can't. She believes in the whole thing. The vote will bring along the millennium. Once we have the power, men are going to be as good as little cherubs terminating in wings round their necks. Drink will disappear. Wives shall be like the fruitful soda-water siphon on the sideboard, and there will be no more struggle for existence, and no more wars. Oh, the earth is going to be a devil of a place when we have finished with it." "Do you talk like this to Miss Bandage?" asked Martin. She smiled for the first time and shook her head. "On the whole, you're rather a commonplace person, Martin," she replied. But you have one remarkable quality. You always seem to compel me to tell you the truth. I don't know why. Perhaps it is just to puzzle you and annoy you and hurt you." "Why should you want to hurt me?" She shrugged her shoulders, and sat with her hands clasping her knees. "Well, for one thing, you were my intimate companion for 3 months, and never for a single second did you think of making love to me. For all the impression I made on you, I might have been your austere maiden aunt. Sometimes I've wanted to take you between my teeth and shake you as a terrier shakes a rat. Instead, like an ass, I've told you the blatant truth." "That's interesting," said Martin calmly. "But you seem to want to hurt everybody, those who don't fall in love with you and those who do. You hurt our poor old Bigourdin, and he hasn't got over it." Corinna looked into the diminutive fire. "I suppose you think I was a fool?" "I can't believe it matters to you what I think," said Martin, his vanity smarting at being lashed for a Joseph Andrews. "It doesn't. But you think me a fool all the same. I'll go on telling you the truth." She flashed a glance at him. "Bigourdin's 1,000,000 times too good for me. I should have led him a beast of a life. He's had a lucky escape. You can tell him that when you go back." "I'm not going back." "What?" she said with a start. He repeated his statement and smiled amiably. "Fed up with being a waiter? I've wondered how long you could stick it. What are you going to do now? As a polite hostess, I suppose I should have asked that when you first came into the room." "I did expect something of the sort," Martin confessed, "until you declared you didn't take an interest in any damn thing." Then they both laughed. Corinna stretched out a hand. "Forgive me," she said. "I've been standing all day in front of the tube station, dressed in a green, mauve and white sandwich board and selling newspapers, and I'm dog-tired and miserable. I would ask you to have some tea, but that would only bring out Isabel, who would talk our heads off. Why have you left Brantôme?" He told her of Bigourdin's proposal and of Fortinbras's counsel, but he made no reference to the flashing of the divine Lucilla across his path. Once he had confessed to her the kiss of the onion-eating damsel who had married the plumber. She had jested, but understood. His romantic knight-errant passion for Lucilla was stars above her comprehension. When he mentioned the fact of the death of Mrs. Fortinbras, Corinna softened. "Poor little Felice, it must have been a great sorrow to her. I'll write to her. She's a dear little girl." She paused for a few moments. "Now look here, Martin," she said, seizing a fragile poker and smiting a black lump of coal the size of a potato. "It strikes me that as fools we're very much in the same box. We've both thrown over a feather-bed existence. I've refused to marry Bigourdin and incidentally to run the Hôtel des Grottes, and you have refused to run the Hôtel des Grottes and incidentally marry Felice." "There was never any question of my marrying Felice," cried Martin hotly. She scrambled to her feet and flung an impatient arm. "You make me tired. Have you a grain of sense in your head or an ounce of blood in your body?" Martin also rose. "And you?" he countered. "What have you?" "Neither," said Corinna. "In that case," said Martin, gathering up hat, stick, and gloves, "I don't see why we should continue a futile conversation." He, devoid of sense and blood, he who had probed the soul of Felice and found there virgin indifference, he who had flung aside a gross temptation, he who was consumed with a burning passion for an incomparable goddess. A chasm thousands of miles wide yawned between him and Corinna. In the same box, indeed! He quivered with indignation. She regarded him curiously, through narrowed eyes. "I do believe," she said slowly, "that I've knocked some sparks out of you at last." "You would knock sparks out of a putty dog," Martin retorted wrathfully. She took hat and stick away from him and laid them on the bamboo table. "Don't let us quarrel," she said more graciously. "Sit down again and finish your story. You said something about Egypt and Fortinbras going with you. Why Egypt?" "Why not?" asked Martin. "I suppose Fortinbras pointed a prophetic finger. There lies the road to happiness." "But what is he doing there himself?" "He's going to talk to the Sphinx," said Martin. "And when you've spent all your capital in riotous living, what are you going to do?" "I don't know, and I don't care," said he. "Well, it's your business, not mine," said Corinna. You're lucky to be able to get out of this beastly climate. I wish I could. They talked for a while the generalities of travel. Then he asked her to dine with him and go to a theatre. This brought her back to herself. She couldn't. She had no time. All her evenings were taken up with meetings which she had to attend, and she hadn't an evening gown fit to wear. I would rather die than appear in a blouse and skirt in the stalls of a theatre. We can go to the pit or upper circle, said Martin, who had never sat in the stalls in his life. But she declined. The prodigal in the pit was too ludicrous. No, she was conscientious. She had adopted martyrdom as a profession. She was paid for being a martyr, and to martyrdom, so long as it didn't include voluntary starvation, she would stick, until she could find a pleasanter and more lucrative means of livelihood. It's all very well for you to talk like that, said Martin in his sober way, but how can you call yourself conscientious when you take these people's money without believing in their cause? Who told you I didn't believe in it? She cried. Do you know what it means to be an utterly useless woman? I do. I'm one. It is to prevent replicas of myself in the next generation that I get up at a public meeting and bleat out votes for women and get ignominiously chucked. Can't you see? No, said Martin. Your attitude is too Laodicean. What? Snapped Corinna. Oh, it's somewhere in the Bible. The Laodiceans were people who blew both hot and cold. My father found scriptural terms for me much more picturesque than that, said Corinna with a laugh. A door opened, and the frozen, blue-nosed head of Miss Bandage appeared. I'm sorry to interrupt you, Corinna, but are we never going to have tea? Corinna apologized. Tea was prepared. Miss Bandage talked on the one and only topic. Martin listened politely. During a pause, while he stood offering a cup for Corinna to fill for the second time, she remarked casually, By the way, you met Miss Meriton, didn't you? The question was like a knock on the head. He nearly dropped the cup. Miss Meriton? Oh, she's a friend of mine. I had a note from her at Christmas to say that she'd been to Brantôme and made your acquaintance, and had carried off Felice to the south of France. Why haven't you told me about her? Under her calm, smiling gaze, he felt himself grow hot and red and angry. He fenced. You must remember my position in Brantôme. She poured the milk into his cup. She said she was going to Egypt. Sugar? Miss Bandage resumed her argument. The remainder of the visit was intolerable. As soon as he could swallow his tea, he took his leave. Corinna followed him into the tiny passage by the flat door. My dear old Martin, she said, impulsively throwing an arm round him and gripping his shoulder, I'm a beast and a brute, and I hate everybody and everything in this infernal world. But I do wish you the very best of good luck. She opened the door, and with both hands thrust him gently forth. Then quickly she closed the door, all but a few inches behind him, and through the slit she cried, Give my love to Lucilla. The door banged, and Martin descended the 5 flights of stairs, lost in the maze of the eternal feminine. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of The Wonderful Year by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 18. Cairo Station. An illumination of livid blue. A horde of brown-legged, turbaned figures wearing red jerseys, on which flaunted in white the names of hotels, and reconstructing Babel. An urbane official, lifting a gold-banded cap in the middle of a small oasis of silence, and inviting Martin in the name of the Semiramis Hotel to surrender luggage and all other cares to his keeping, and to follow the stream through the exit to the hotel motor. A phantasmagoria of east and west, rendered more fantastic by the shadows cast by the high arc lamps. He had lost sight of Fortinbras, who, bag in hand, his impedimenta being of the scantiest, had disappeared in quest of the palm tree against whose trunk he presumably was to pass the night. Martin emerged from the station, entered the automobile, one of a long row, and waited with his fellow passengers until the roof was stacked with luggage. Then the drive through European streets suggestive of Paris, and the sudden halt at the hotel. A dazzling vision of a lounge, a swift upward journey in a lift worked by a Nubian gorgeous in scarlet and gold, a walk down a corridor, a door flung open, and Martin found himself in his bedroom. An Arab brought hot water and retired. Martin opened the shutters of the window and looked out. It was hard moonlight. Beneath him shimmered a broad ribbon of water, against which were silhouetted outlandish masts and spars of craft moored against the embankment. The dark mass on the further shore seemed to be pleasant woods. The water could be nothing else than the Nile, the sacred river, the first river in which he had taken a romantic interest, on account of Moses and the Ark and Pharaoh's daughter, the mighty river which is the very life of a vast country, the most famous river in the world. He regarded it with a curious mixture of awe and disappointment. On his right it was crossed by a bridge dotted with the slowly moving lamps of carts, and now and then flashing with the headlights of a motor car. It was not unlike any ordinary river, the Thames, the Seine, the Rhone at Geneva. He had imagined it broad as the Amazon. Yet it was wonderful. The historic water, the moonlight, the clear Egyptian air in which floated a vague perfume of spice, the dimly seen long-robed figures seated on a bench by the parapet on the other side of the road, whose guttural talk rose like a proclamation of the Orient. He leaned out over the iron railing. On his left stood out dreamily defined against the sky two shadowy little triangles. He wondered what they could be. Suddenly came the shock of certainty. They were the pyramids. He rubbed his eyes and looked again. A thrill ran over his skin. He had not counted on being brought up bang, as it were, against them. He had imagined that one journeyed for half a day on a camel through a trackless desert in order to visit these wonders of the world. But here he was, staring at them from the hotel window of a luxurious capital. He stared at them for a long time. Yes, there was the Nile, there were the pyramids, and after a knock at the door, there was his luggage. He became conscious of hunger, also of Lucilla, more splendid than moonlit Nile and pyramids and all the splendours of Egypt put together. Hunger. It was 9:30, and he'd eaten nothing since lunch on shipboard. Counselled speedy ablutions and a descent in quest of food. Lucilla ordained correctitude of vesture. His first evening on board ship had taught him that dinner jacket, suit, and black tie were the only wear. He changed and went downstairs. A chasseur informed him that Miss Meriton was staying in the hotel, but that she had gone to the dance at the Savoy. When would she be back? The chasseur, a child rendered old by accumulated knowledge of trivial fact, replied that Cairo was very gay this season, the dances went on till the morning hours, and insinuated that Miss Meriton was as gay as anybody. Martin walked through the lounge into the restaurant and supped. He supped exceedingly well. Bearing in mind Fortinbras's counsel of lordliness and the ways of lordly motorists passing through Brantôme, he ordered a pint of champagne. He was served by an impeccable waiter, with lilac revers and brass buttons to his coat. He noted the livery with a professional eye. The restaurant was comparatively empty. Only at one table sat a party of correctly dressed men and women. A few others were occupied by his travelling companions, still in the garb of travel. Martin, mellowed by the champagne, adjusted his black tie and preened his white shirt-front, in the hope that the tweed-clad newcomers would see him and marvel and learn from him, Martin Overshaw, obscure and ignorant adventurer, what was required by English decorum. After his meal he sat in the lounge and ordered Turkish coffee, liqueur brandy, and cigarettes. And so, luxuriously housed, clothed, and fed, he entered on the newest phase of his new life. 6 months ago he had considered his sportive ride through France with Corinna a thrilling adventure. He smiled at his simplicity. An adventure, that tame jog-trot tour, as comparable to this as his then-companion to the radiant lady of his present quest. Now indeed he had burned his boats, thrown his cap over the windmills, cast his frock to the nettles. The reckless folly of it all had kept his veins a-tingle, his head a-whirl. At every moment during the past fortnight something amazingly new had flashed into his horizon. The very sleeping berth in the train de luxe had been a fresh experience. So too was the awakening to the warmth and sunshine of Marseille. Save for a crowded hour of inglorious life, He was a poor sailor, and now and then on cross-channel boats he had never set foot on a ship. He wandered about the ocean-going liner with a child's delight. Fortune favoured him with a spell of blue weather. He scoffed at seasickness. The meals characterized by many passengers as abominable, he devoured as though they were Lucullian feasts. He made acquaintance with folks going not only to Egypt, but to Peshawar and Mandalay and Singapore, and other places with haunting names. Some shocked him by calling them God-forsaken holes and cursing their luck. Others, mainly women, going thither for the first time, shared his emotions. He was surprised at the ease with which he fell into casual talk with strangers. Sometimes a child was a means of introduction to his mother. Sometimes a woman in the next deck chair would open a conversation. Sometimes Fortinbras, chatting with a knot of people, would catch him as he passed and present him blandly. Among the minor things that gave him cause for wonder was the swift popularity of his companion. No longer did his costume stamp Fortinbras as a man apart from the laity. He wore the easy tweeds and soft felt hat of a score of other elderly gentlemen on board, even the gold watch chain which he had redeemed after a long, long sojourn at the Mount of Piety. But this very commonplace of his attire brought into relief the nobility of his appearance. His massive face, lined with care, his broad brow, his prominent light blue kindly eyes, his pursy and benevolent mouth, his magnificent Abbé Liste shock of white hair, now carefully tended, his impressive air of dignity, all marked him as a personage of distinction. He aroused the idle curiosity of the idle voyagers. Husbands were bidden by wives to talk to him and see what he was like. Husbands obeyed, as is the human though marriage vow subversive way of husbands, and meekly returned with information. A capital fellow, most interesting chap, English of course, very courtly old bird, like so-and-so who was ambassador. Old school, knows everything, talks like a book. Quoth any one of the wives, her woman's mind intent on the particular, but who is he? The careless husband, his masculine mind merely concerned with the general, did not know. He had not thought of asking. How could he ask? And what did it matter? The wife sighed. Bring him along, and I will soon find out. Fortinbras, as fit opportunity, was brought along. The lady unconsciously surrendered to his spell. One has not practised as a Marchand de Bonheur for nothing. Now I know all about him, said any one of the wives to any one of the husbands. Why are men so stupid? He's an old Winchester boy. He's a retired philosopher, and he lives in France. That was all she learned about Fortinbras. But Fortinbras, in that trial interview, learned everything about the lady, serenely unconscious of intimate avowal. My young friend, said he to Martin, the secret of social influence is to present yourself to each individual rather as a sympathetic intelligence than as a forcible personality. The patient takes no interest in the morbid symptoms of his physician, but every patient is eager to discuss his symptoms with the kindly physician who will listen to them, free, gratis, and for nothing. By adopting this attitude, I can evoke from one the dramatic ambitions of her secret heart, from another the history of her children's ailments and the recipe for the family cough cure, from a third the moving story of strained relations with his parents because he desired to marry his uncle's typist, the elderly crown and glory of her sex, and from a fourth an intricate account of a peculiarly shady deal in lard. That sounds all right, said Martin, but in order to get people to talk to you, say in the 4 cases you have mentioned, you must know something about the theatre, bronchitis, love, and the lard trade, said Fortinbras, touching the young man's shoulder. The experienced altruist with an eye to his own advantage knows something about everything. Martin, following the precepts of his mentor, practised the arts of fence, parrying the thrusts of personal questions on the part of his opponent, and riposting with such questions on his own. It is necessary, said the stage. What are you among these respectable Britons of substance but an adventurer? Put yourself at the mercy of one of these old warriors with grey motor veils and steel knitting needles, and she will pluck out the heart of your mystery in a jiffy, and throw it on the deck for all to feed on. Thus the voyage, incidentally was it not to Kythera, transcended all his dreams of social amenity. It was a long, protracted party in which he lost his shyness, finding frank welcome on all sides. To the man of 30 who had been deprived all his man's life of the commonplace general intercourse with his kind, this daily talk with a girl here, a young married woman there, an old lady somewhere else, and all sorts of conditions of men in the smoking-room and on deck, was nothing less than a kind of social debauch, intoxicating him, keeping him blissfully awake of nights in his upper berth, while Fortinbras snored below. Then, soon after daybreak, to mount to the wet, sunlit deck after his cold sea-water bath, perhaps to meet a hardy and healthy English girl, fresh as the Aegean morning, to tramp up and down with her for development of appetite, talking of nothing but the glitter of the sea, the stuffiness of cabins, the dishes they each would choose for breakfast, to descend into the warm comforting smell of the dining saloon, to fall voraciously on porridge and eggs and kidneys and marmalade, to go on deck again, knowing that in a couple of hours' time stewards would come to him fainting from hunger with bowls of chicken broth, that in an hour or two afterwards there would be lunch to be selected from a menu a foot long in close print, and so on during the golden and esurient day, to meet Fortinbras, late and luxurious riser, to bask for an hour like a plum in the sunshine of his wisdom, to continue the debauch of the day before, to sight great sailing vessels with bellying canvas, resplendent majesty of past centuries, or on the other hand the grey grim blocks of battleships, to pass the sloping shores of historic islands, Crete, home of the Minotaur, whose inhabitants, Cretans are liars, Cretans are men, and therefore all men are liars, had furnished the stock example of fallacy in the syllogism, to watch the green wake cleaving the dark blue sea, to make his way up and down decks, through the steerage, and stand in the bows, swept by the exhilarating air, with the pulse-racking sense that he was speaking to the lodestar of his one desire, to find wildness of delight in these commonplaces of travel, to live as he lived, to vibrate as he vibrated with every nerve from dawn to dawn, to be drunk with the sheer ecstasy of existence, so that the past became a black abyss, and the future an amethystine haze glorified by the sons of the morning singing for joy, is given but to few, is given to none but poor starved souls, is given to none of the poor starved souls but those whom the high gods in obedience to their throw of the dice happen to select. Martin, sitting in a deep armchair in the Semiramis Hotel, dreamed of all these things, unconscious of the flight of time. Suddenly he became aware that he was the only occupant of the lounge, all the other folk having returned soberly to their rooms. Already a few early arrivals from the Savoy dance passed across the outer hall on their way to the lift. Drowsy with happiness, he went to bed. Tomorrow, Lucilla. He became aware of her standing by the bureau, licking a stamp to put on a letter. She wore a white coat and skirt and a straw hat with cherries on it. He could not see her face, but he guessed the blue veins on the uplifted, ungloved hand that held the stamp. On his approach she turned and uttered a little laughing gasp of recognition, stuck the stamp on hastily, and stretched out her hand. "Why," she cried, "it's you! You really have come!" "Did you think I would break my promise?" he asked, his eyes drinking in her beauty. "I didn't know how seriously you regarded it." "I thought of nothing but Egypt since I said you had pointed out the way," he replied. "You commanded, I obeyed." She caught up her long parasol and gloves that lay on the ledge of the bureau. "If everybody did everything I told them," she laughed, "I should have my hands full. They don't, as a general rule, but when they do, I take it as a compliment. Makes me feel good to see you. When did you come?" She put him through a short catechism. What boat? What kind of voyage? Where was he staying? Finally, "Do you know many people in Cairo?" "Not a soul," said Martin. With both arms behind her back, she rested lightly on the parasol and beamed graciously. "I know millions," she said, not without a touch of exaggeration, which pleased him. "Would you like to trust yourself to me? Put yourself entirely in my hands?" "I could dream of nothing more enchanting," replied Martin. But I don't want to make myself an infliction." "You're going to be a delight. You know in the cinematograph how an invisible pencil writes things on the sheet, or how a message is stamped out on the tape and you look and wonder what's coming next? Well, I want to see how this country is going to be stamped letter by letter on your virgin mind. It's a thing I've been longing for, to show somebody with sense like yourself. Egypt of the Pharaohs and Egypt of the English. How long can you stay? Indefinitely, said Martin. I have no plans. From here you might go to Honolulu or Rangoon, or Greenland or Cape Horn, said Martin. She nodded, smiling approval. That is what I call a free and enlightened citizen of the world. Let us sit down. I'm waiting for my friend, Mrs. Dangerfield of Philadelphia. Her husband's here, too. You'll like him. I generally travel round with somebody, just for the sake of a table companion. I'm silly enough to feel a fool eating alone every day in a restaurant. He drew a wicker chair for her and sat beside her. She deposited parasol and gloves on the little round table and swept him with a quizzical glance from his well-fitting brown shoes to his trim black hair. May I, without impertinence, compliment you on your colour scheme? His olive cheek flushed like a girl's. He devoted an hour's concentrated thought to it before he rose. How should he appear in the presence of the divinity? He decided on grey flannels, grey shirt, purple socks, and tie. He wondered whether she guessed the part she had played in his anxious selection. Remembering the splotch of grease, he said, I hadn't much choice of clothes when you last saw me. She laughed. Tell me all about Brantôme. How is my dear little friend Felice? He gave her discreet news. And the incomparable Fortinbras? You'll doubtless soon be able to judge for yourself. He's here. In Cairo, you don't say. Mingled with her expression of surprise was a little perplexity of the brow, as though, seeing the Fortinbras of the Petit Cornichon, she wondered what on earth she could do with him. He came with me, said Martin. Is he staying in this hotel? No, said Martin. Her brow grew smooth again. How did he manage to get all this way? Has he retired from business? I don't think so. He needed a holiday. You see, he came into a little money on the death of his wife. His wife dead? Lucille queried. Felice's mother? I didn't know. Perhaps that's why she hasn't written to me for such a long time. I think there must be some queer story connected with that mother, she added shrewdly. Anyway, Fortinbras can't be broken-hearted, or he wouldn't come on a jaunt to Egypt. Too well-bred to examine Martin on his friend's private affairs, she changed the talk in her quick, imperious way. Martin sat like a man bewitched, fascinated by her remembered beauties, the lazy music of her voice, her mobile lips, her brown eyelashes. His heart beat at the realization of so many dreams. He listened, his brain scarcely following what she said. That she spoke with the tongue of an angel was enough. Presently a stout, pleasant-faced woman of 30 came towards them with many apologies for lateness. This was Mrs. Dangerfield. Lucilla presented Martin. Behold in me the complete dragoman. Mr. Overshaw has engaged me for the season. It's his first visit to Egypt, and I'm going to show him round. I'll draw up a programme for a personally conducted tour, every hour accounted for and replete with distraction. It sounds dreadful, laughed Mrs. Dangerfield. Do you think you'll survive, Mr. Overshaw? Not only that, said Martin, but I hope for a new lease of life. We start, said Lucilla, with a drive through the town, during which I shall point out the Qas el Nil barracks, the Bank of Egypt, and the Opera House. Then we shall enter on the shopping expedition in the Muski, where I shall prevent Mrs. Dangerfield from being robbed while bargaining for Persian lac. I'm ready, Laura, if you are. She led the way out. Martin, exchanging words of commonplace with Mrs. Dangerfield, followed in an ecstasy. Did ever woman, outside Botticella's Primavera, walk with such lissomeness? A chasseur turned the four-flanged doors, and they emerged into the clear morning sunshine. The old bearded Arab carriage porter called an Hotel Arabea from the stand. But while the driver, correct in metal-buttoned livery coat and tarbush, was dashing up with his pair, Martin caught sight of Fortinbras walking towards them. "There he is," said Martin. "Who?" "Fortinbras." "Nonsense," said Lucilla. "That's an English cabinet minister, or an American millionaire, or the keeper of a gambling saloon." But when he came nearer, she admitted it was Fortinbras. She waved her hand in recognition. Nothing could have been more charming than her greeting, nothing more urbane than his acknowledgment or his bow on introduction to Mrs. Dangerfield. He had come, said he, to lay his respectful homage at her feet, also to see how his young friend was faring in a strange land. Lucilla asked him where he was staying. "When last I saw you," he answered, "I'd said something about the perch of the old vulture." She eyed him, smiling. "You look more like the wanton lapwing." "In that case I need even a smaller perch, the merest twig." "But merest twig, Caro, isn't an address," cried Lucilla. "How am I to get hold of you when I want you?" Fortinbras regarded her with humorous benevolence. The question was characteristic. He knew her to be generous, warm-hearted, and impatient of trivial convention. Therefore he had not hesitated to go to her in his anxious hour. But he also knew how those long, delicate fingers had an irresistible habit of drawing unwary humans into her harmless web. He had not come to Cairo just to walk into Lucilla's parlour. He wanted to buzz about Egypt in philosophic and economical independence. "That, my dear Lucilla," said he, "is one more enigma to be put to the credit of the land of riddles." Ibrahim stood impassively holding open the door of the Arabia. A couple of dragomen in resplendent robes and turbans, seeing a new and prosperous English tourist, had risen from their bench on the other side of the road, and lounged gracefully forward. "You're the most exasperating person I ever met," exclaimed Lucilla. "But while I have you, I've got to keep you. Come to lunch at 1:15. If you don't, I'll never speak to you again." "I'll come to lunch at 1:15 with very great pleasure," said Fortinbras. The ladies entered the carriage. Martin said hastily, "You gave me the slip last night." "I did," said Fortinbras. He drew the young man a pace aside and whispered, "You think those are doves harnessed to the chariot. They're not. They're horses." Martin broke away with a laugh and sprang to the back seat of the carriage. It drove off. The dragoman came up to the lonely Fortinbras. Did he want a guide? The citadels? The pyramids? Saqqara? Fortinbras turned to the impassive Ibrahim, and in his grand manner and with impressive gesture said, "Will you tell them they are too beautiful? They would eclipse the splendour of all the monuments I am here to visit." He walked away, and Ibrahim, translating roughly to the dragoman, conveyed uncomplimentary references to the virtue of their grandmothers. Meanwhile Martin, in beatitude, sat on the little seat facing his goddess. She was an integral part of the exotic setting of Cairo. It was less real life than an Arabian Nights' tale. She was interfused with all the sunshine and colour and wonder. Only the camels, padding along in single file, their bodies half hidden beneath packs of coarse grass, seemed alien to her. They held up their heads as the carriage passed them with a damnably supercilious air. One of them seemed to catch his eye and express contempt unfathomable. He shook a fist at him. "I hate those brutes," said he. "Good gracious, why?" asked Lucilla. "They're so picturesque. A camel is the one thing I really can draw properly." "Well, I dislike them intensely," said he. "They're inhuman." He could not translate his unformulated thought into conventional words. But he knew that at the summons of the high gods, all the world of animate beings would fall down and worship her, every breathing thing but the camel. He hated the camel. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of The Wonderful Year by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 19. Lucilla kept her word. She was not a woman of half measures. Just as she had set out, impelled by altruistic fancy, to carry provincial little Felice through part of a Riviera season, and had thoroughly accomplished her object, so now she devoted herself wholeheartedly to the guidance of Martin through the land of Egypt. In doing so she was conscious of helping the world along. Hitherto it was impeded in its progress by a mild, scholarly gentleman wasting his potentialities in handing soup to commercial travellers. These potentialities she had decided to develop, so that in due season a new force might be evolved which would give the old world a shove. To express her motives in less universal terms, she set herself the holiday task of making a man of him. To herself she avowed her entire disinterestedness. She had often thought of adopting and training a child, but that would take a prodigiously long time, and the child might complicate her future life. On the other hand, with grown men and women, things went more quickly. You could see the grass grow. The swifter process appealed to her temperament. First, she incorporated him, without chance of escape, in her own little coterie, the Dangerfields and the Watney Holcombs, father, mother, and daughter, Americans who lived in Paris. They received him, guaranteed by Lucilla, as an Englishman without guile, with democratic American frankness. Of Mr. Dangerfield, a grim-featured banker, possessing a dry, subrident humour, Martin was somewhat afraid. But with the Watney Holcombs, cheery, pleasure-loving folk, he was soon at his ease. "The only thing you mustn't do," said Lucilla, "is to fall in love with Maisie." Maisie was a slip of a girl of 19, whom he regarded as an amusing and precocious child. There is already a young man floating about in the smoke of St. Louis. It was an opportunity to make romantic repudiation, to proclaim the faith by which he lived. But he had not yet the courage. He laughed and declared that the smoky young man might sleep peacefully of nights. The damsel herself took him as a new toy and played with him harmlessly, and, subtly inspired by Lucilla, commanded her father, a chubby, innocent man with a face like a red gold-spectacled apple, to bring Martin from remote meal solitude and establish him permanently at their table. Thus, Martin, being an accepted member of a joyous company, could go here, there, and everywhere with any one of them without furnishing cause for gossip. Lucilla had a deft way of not putting herself in the wrong with a censorious though charming world. Under the nominal auspices of the Dangerfields and the Watney Holcombs, Martin mingled with the best of Cairo society. He attended race meetings, golf club teas, hotel balls, and many little suppers. He went to a reception at the agency and shook hands with the great English ruler of Egypt. He was swept away in automobiles to Helouan and Heliopolis, to the Menor House to see the pyramids and the Sphinx, both by daylight and by moonlight. A young soldier, discovering a bond in knowledge of love of France, invited him to mess on a guest night. Lucilla, ever watchful and tactful, saw that he went in full dress, white tie and white waistcoat, and not in dinner jacket. She pervaded his atmosphere, teaching him, training him, opening up new vistas for his mind and soul. Every encomium passed on him she accepted as a tribute to herself. It was infinitely more interesting than training a dog or a horse. Martin, blissfully unaware of experiment or even of guidance, lived in a dream of delight. His goddess seemed ever ready to hand. Together they visited mosques and spent enchanted hours in the bazaar. She knew her way about the labyrinth, could even speak a few words of Arabic. Supreme fair product of the West, she stood divinely pure, amid the swarthy vividness of the unalterable East. She was a flawless jewel in the barbaric setting of those narrow streets, filled with guttural noise, outlandish bustle of camels and donkeys and white-clad men, smells of hoary spiciness, colour from the tattered child's purple and scarlet, to the yellow of the cinnamon pounded at doorways in the 3-foot mortars. Those streets winding in short joints, each given up to its particular industry. Copper-beaters, brass-workers, leather sellers, workers in cedar and mother-of-pearl, sellers of cakes and kebabs, all plying their trades in the frontless caves that served as shops. Streets so narrow and sunless that one could see but a slit of blue above the latticed fronts of the crazy houses. He loved to see her deal with the supple Orientals. In bargaining she did not haggle. With smiling majesty she paid into the long, slender palm a third or a half or 2/3 of the price demanded, according to her infallible sense of values, and walked away serene possessor of the merchandise. Lucilla, having a facile memory, had not boasted in vain that she could play dragoman. He found from the books that her archaeological information was correct. He drank in her wisdom. For his benefit she ordained a general expedition to Saqqara. One golden day the party took train to Badrashan, whence, on donkeys, they plunged into the desert. Riding in front with him, she was his for most of that golden day. She discoursed on the colossal statue stretched by the wayside of Rameses II, on the step pyramid, on the beauties of the little tombs of Tai and Ptahhotep, whose sculptures and paintings of the fifth dynasty were alive, proceeding direct from the soul of the artist, and thus crying shame on the conventional invitations of 1,000 or 2 years later, with which most of the great monuments of Egypt are adorned. And all she said was Holy Writ. And at Mariette's house, where they lunched, the bungalow pitched in the middle of the baking desert and overlooking the crumbling brown masses of tombs, he glanced around at their picnicking companions and marvelled at her grace in eating a hard-boiled egg. It was a noisy, excited party, and it was Lucilla this and Lucilla that all the time, for there was hot argument. "I don't take any stock in bulls, so I'm not going to see the Serapeum," declared Miss Watney Holcombe. "But Lucilla says you've got to," exclaimed Martin. Then he realized that unconsciously he had used her Christian name. He flushed, and under cover of the talk turned to her with an apology. He met laughing eyes. "Scrubby little artists in Paris call me Lucilla without the quiver of an eyelash." What may be permissible to a scrubby little artist in Paris," said Martin, "may be permitted to one who ought to know better." She passed him a plate containing the last banana. He declined with a courteous gesture. "Martin," she said, deliberately dumping the fruit in front of him, "if you don't look out, you will die of conscientiousness." During part of the blazing ride back to Bad Ration, when the accidents of route and the vagrant whimsies of donkeys brought him to the side of the dry Mr. Dangerfield, he reflected on the attitude of men admitted to the intimacy of goddesses and great queens. What did Leicester call the august Elizabeth when she deigned to lay aside her majesty? And what were the sensations of Anchises, father of pious Aeneas, when he first addressed Venus by her petit nom? "Well," said Fortinbras the next day, "and how is my speculator in happiness getting on?" They were sitting on the terrace of Shepherd's Hotel, their usual midday meeting-place. Save on these occasions, the philosopher seemed to live dimly in a sort of oriental twilight. Yet all that Martin had seen, with the exception of the social moving picture, he had also seen, and therefrom sucked vastly more juice than the younger man. How and in what company he had visited the various monuments, he did not say. It amused him to maintain his mysterious independence. Very rarely, and only when compelled by the imperious ruthlessness of Lucilla, did he otherwise emerge from his obscurity than on these daily visits to the famous terrace. There, surrounded by chatter in all tongues and by representatives of all cities, from Seattle round the earth's girth to Tokyo, he loved to sit and watch the ever-shifting scene, the traffic of all the centuries in the narrow street, from the laden ass driven by a replica of one of Joseph's brethren, to the modern Rolls-Royce sweeping along with the fat and tarbushed dignitary of the court, the ox-cart omnibus carrying its dingy load of veiled women, the poor funeral procession, the coffin borne on shoulders amid the perfunctory ululations of hired mourners. On the footpaths the contrast of slave-attended, black-robed, trim-shod Egyptian ladies in yashmaks, and the frank, summer-clad Western women, Sudanese and Turks and Greeks and Jews, and straight, clear-eyed English officers, and German tourists attired for the wilds of the Zambesi, and here and there a Gordon Highlander swinging along in kilts and white tunic, and lounging against the terrace balustrade, the dragomen, flaunting villains gay in rainbow robes, and the vendors of beads and fly-whisks and postcards holding up their wares at arm's height and regarding prospective purchasers with the eye of a crumb-expectant though self-respecting dog who sits on his tail by his master's side. And, across the way, the curio shops rich with the spoils of Samarkand. From all of these, when alone, he garnered the harvest of a quiet eye. When Martin was with him, he shared with his pupil the golden grain of the panorama. "How," said he, "is my speculator in happiness getting on?" "The stock is booming," replied Martin with a laugh. "What an education," said Fortinbras, "is the society of American men of substance." "It pleases you to be ironical," said Martin, "but you speak literal truth. An American doesn't set a man down as a damned fool because he is ignorant of his own particular line of business. Dangerfield, for instance, who keeps a working balance of his soul locked up in a safe in Wall Street, has explained to me the New York Stock Exchange with the most courteous simplicity." "And in return," said Fortinbras, waving away a cellar of rhinoceros horn amber with the gesture of a monarch dismissing his chamberlain, "you have given him an exhaustive criticism, not untempered with jaundice, of lower middle-class education in England." "How the deuce," said Martin, recklessly throwing his half-finished cigarette over the balustrade, "how the deuce did you know that?" "C'est mon secret," replied Fortinbras. "It is all the secret of a dry and successful man like Mr. Dangerfield, with whom I am sorry to have had no more than 10 minutes' conversation. In those 10 minutes I discovered in him a lamentable ignorance of the works of Chaucer, Cervantes, and Turgenev. But for my benefit he sized up a few clattering epigrams, the essence of the Anglo-Saxon, Spanish, and Slavonic races, and for his own was extracting from me all I know about Tolstoy, when Lucilla called me away to expound to his wife the French family system, from which you'll observe that the American believes in a free exchange of knowledge as a system of education. To revert to my original question, however, you imagine that your present path is strewn with roses?" "I do," said Martin. "That's all I desire to know, my dear fellow," said Fortinbras benevolently. "And what about yourself?" asked Martin. "What about your pursuit of happiness?" "I am studying Arabic," replied Fortinbras, "and discussing philosophy with one Abu Mohammed, a very learned doctor of theology, with a very long white beard, from whose sedative companionship I derive much spiritual anodyne." Soon after this, the whole Semiramis party packed up their traps and went by night train to Luxor. There they settled down for a while and did the things that the floating population of Luxor do. They rode on donkeys and on camels, and they drove in carriages and sand-carts. They visited the tombs of the kings and the tombs of the queens, and the tombs of the ministers, and Karnak, and their own private and particular temple of Luxor. And Martin amassed a vast amount of erudition, and learned to know gods and goddesses by their attitudes, and talked about them with casual intimacy. His nature drank in all that there was of wonder and charm in these relics of a colossal past, like an insatiable sponge. And in Upper Egypt the humble present is but a relic of the past. The 20th-century fellaheen guiding the ox-drawn wooden plough might have served for models of any bas-relief or painting in any tomb of thousands of years ago. So too might the half-naked men in the series of terraced trenches draining water from the Nile by means of rude wooden lever and bucket to irrigate the land. The low mud houses of the villages were the same as those which covered vast expanses on either side of the river, made up the mighty and populous city of Thebes. And the peasantry, purer in type than the population of Cairo, which till then was all the Egypt that Martin knew, were of the same race as those warriors who gained vain victories for unsympathetic kings. The ridgy, rocky, sandy desert, startlingly yellow against the near-blue dome of sky. A group of donkeys, donkey boys, violently clad dragomen, one or two black-robed, white-turbaned official guides, Europeans as exotic to the scene as Eskimo in Hyde Park. An excavated descent to a hole surmounted by a signboard as though it were the entrance to some underground boozing ken. An Egyptian soldier in khaki and red tarbush. An inclined plane, then flight after flight of wooden steps through painted chamber after painted chamber, and at last, deep down in the earth, lit by electric light, the heart of the tomb's poor mystery, the mummified body of a great king, Amenhotep II, in an uncovered sandstone sarcophagus. It is the world's greatest monument to the awful and futile vanity of man. "Thank God," said Martin, as he came out with Lucilla into the open air. "Thank God for the great world, and sunshine, and life. The whole thing is fascinating, is soul-racking, but I hate these people who live for nothing but death. I wanted to bash that king's face in. There was that poor devil of an artist who spent his soul over those sculptures, going at them hammer and chisel in the back bowels of the earth, with nothing but an oil lamp on the scaffold beside him for years and years. And when he had finished, calmly put to death by that brute lying there, so that he should not glorify any other swollen-headed worm of a tyrant. They sat down on the sand in a triangular patch of shade. Lucilla regarded him with approbation. "I love to hear you talk vehemently," she remarked. "It's because I've learned to feel vehemently," said Martin. "Since when?" "Since I first met you," said Martin with sudden daring. "It's not my example you've been profiting by," she laughed. "You've never heard me raving at a poor old mummy." Cool and casual, she warded off the shaft of his implied declaration. He had not another weapon to his hand. He said, "You've said things equally violent when you have felt deeply. That is your great power. You live intensely. Everything you do, you put your whole self into. You have the faculty of making everybody around you do the same." At that moment Mr. Watney Holcombe appeared at the mouth of the tomb, mopping his rubicund face. At Lucilla he shook a playful fist. "Not another darn monument for me this day." "I don't seem to have succeeded with him, anyway," she said in a low and ironical voice. Martin, gentlest of creatures, felt towards Mr. Watney Holcombe for the moment as he felt towards Amen-Hetep. The rosy-faced gentleman sat beside them and talked flippantly of gods and goddesses, and soon the rest of the party joined them. The opportunity for which Martin had waited so long, of which he had dreamed the extravagant dreams of an imaginative child, was gone. He would have to wait yet further. But he had spoken as he had never before dared to speak. He had told her unmistakably that she had taught him to feel and to live. As the other ladies approached, he sprang to his feet and held out a hand to aid the divinity to rise. She accepted it frankly, nodding him pleasant thanks. The pressure of her little moist palm kept him a tingle for long afterwards. They had a gay and intimate ride home. The donkey boys thwacked the donkeys so that they galloped to the shattering of sustained conversation between the riders. But in one breathing space, while they jogged along side by side, she said, "If I have done anything to help you on your way, I regard it as a privilege." "You've done everything for me," said Martin. "To whom else but you do I owe all this?" His gesture embraced earth and sky. "I only made a suggestion," said Lucilla. "You've done infinitely more. Anybody giving advice could say, 'Go to Egypt.' You said, 'Come to Egypt.' And therein lies all the difference. You have given me of yourself so bountifully, so generously." He paused. "Go on," she said. "I love to hear you talk." But the donkey boys, perceiving Mr. Dangerfield mounted on a fleet quadruped about to break through the advance guard, thwacked the donkeys again, and Martin, unless he shouted breathlessly, could not go on talking. That evening there was a dance at the Winter Palace Hotel where they were staying. Martin, on his arrival at Cairo, had been as ignorant of dancing as a giraffe. But Lucilla, Mrs. Dangerfield, and Maisie, having commandeered the Watney Holcombe's private sitting-room at the Semiramis whenever it suited them, had put him through a severe and summary course. He threw himself devotedly into the new delight. A lithe figure and a quick ear aided him. Before he left Cairo he could dance one-steps and two-steps with the best, and so a new joy was added to his existence. And to him it was a joy infinitely more sensuous and magnetic than to those who from childhood have regarded dancing as a commonplace social pleasure. To understand, you must put yourself in the place of this undeveloped, finely tempered man of 30. His arm was around the beloved body, his hand clasped hers, the fragrance of her hair was in his nostrils, their limbs moved in perfect unison with the gay tune. His heart sang to the music, his feet were winged with laughter. In young enjoyment she said with literal truthfulness, "You are a born dancer." He glowed and murmured glad incoherences of acknowledgment. "You're born all sorts of other things, I believe," she said, "that only need bringing out. You have a rhythmical soul." What she meant precisely she did not know, but it sounded mighty fine in Martin's ears. Ever since his first interview with Fortinbras he had been curiously interested in that vague organ and its evolution. Now it was rhythmical. To explain herself she added, "It is in harmony with the great laws of existence." A new light shone in his eyes, and he held himself proudly. He looked quite a gallant fellow, straight, English, masterful. Her skirts swished the feet of a couple of elderly English ladies sitting by the wall. Her quick woman's ears caught the remark, "What a handsome couple!" She flushed, and her eyes sparkled into his. He replied to her psychological dictum, "At any rate, it's in harmony with the deepest of them all." "What is that?" "The fundamental law," said he. They danced the gay dance to the end. They stopped breathless and laughed into each other's eyes. She took his arm, and they left the ballroom. "Unless you will dance with me again," he said, "this is my last dance tonight." "Why?" "I leave you to guess," said he. "It was as near perfection as could be," she admitted. "I feel rather like that myself. Perhaps more so, for I don't want to spoil things even by dancing with you again." "Do you really mean it?" She nodded frankly, intimately, deliciously. "Let us go outside, away from everybody," he suggested. They crossed the lounge and reached the western door. Both were living a little above themselves. "When last we talked sense," she said, "you spoke about a fundamental law. Come and expound it to me." They stood on the terrace amid other flushed and happy dancers. "Let us get away from these people." "Who know nothing of the fundamental law," said Lucilla. So they went along a spur of the terrace, a sort of rococo bastion guarding the entrance to the hotel, and there they found solitude. They sat beneath the velvet star-hung sky. 50 yards away flowed the Nile, with now and then a flashing ripple. From a gayassa with ghostly white sail creeping down the river came an Arab chant. The flowers of the bougainvillea on the hotel porch gleamed dim and pale. A touch of camsin gave languor to the air. Lucilla drew off her gloves, bade him put them down for her. He preferred to keep them warm and fragrant, a part of herself. "Now about this fundamental law," she said in her lazy contralto. Her hand hung carelessly, temptingly, over the arm of her chair. Graciously, she allowed him to take and hold it. "Surely you know." "I want you to tell me, Mr. Philosopher." He dallied with the adorable situation. "Since when have I become master and you pupil, Lucilla?" "Since you began, presumably, to plunge deep into profundities of wisdom where I can't follow you. Behold me at your feet." He moved his chair close to hers, and she allowed him to play with her slender fingers. "The fundamental law of life," said he, bending towards her, "is love." "I wonder," said Lucilla. She lay in the long chair, her head against the back. He drew her fingers to his lips. "I'm sure of it. I'm sure of it, as I'm sure that there's a God in heaven, as that," he whispered, in what the sophisticated may term an anticlimax, "there's a goddess on earth." "Who is the goddess?" she murmured. "You," said he. "I like being called a goddess," she said, "especially after dancing the two-step. Hymns ancient and modern." "Do you know what is the most ancient hymn in the world?" "No." "Shall I tell you?" "Am I not here to be instructed?" "You are beautiful, and I love you. You are wonderful, and I love you. You are adorable, and I love you." "How did you learn to become so lyrical?" Martin knew not. He was embarked on the highest adventure of his life. A super Martin seemed to speak. Her tone was playful, not ironical. It encouraged him to flights more lyrical still. In the daylight of reason what he said was amazing nonsense. Beneath the Egyptian stars, in the atmosphere drowsy with the sense of the East and the touch of camsin, it sounded to receptive ears beautifully romantic. Through the open door came the strains of an old-fashioned waltz, perhaps meretricious, but in the exotic surroundings sensuous and throbbing with passion. He bent over her, and now possessed both hands. "All that I feel for you, all that you are to me," he said, concluding his rhapsody. Then, as she made no reply, he asked, "You aren't angry with me?" "I'm not a granite sphinx," she said in her low voice. "No one has ever said things like that to me before. I don't say men haven't tried. They have. But they've always made themselves ridiculous. I've always wanted to laugh at them." Said Martin, "You are not laughing at me." "No," she whispered, and after a long pause, "No, I am not laughing at you." She turned her face to him. Her lips were very near. Mortal man could have done neither more nor less than that which Martin did. He kissed her. Then he drew back, shaken to the roots of his being. She, with closed eyes, he saw the rise and fall of her bosom. The universe, earth and stars, and the living bit of the cosmos that was he, hung in breathless suspense. Time stopped. There was no space. He was holding her beloved hand so delicately and adorably veined. Before his eyes, in the dim light, were her lips, slightly parted, which he had just kissed. Presently she stirred, withdrew her hands, passed them across her eyes and with dainty touches about her hair as she sat up. Time went on, and there was space again, and the stars followed their courses. Martin threw an arm round her. "Lucilla!" he cried quiveringly. But with a quick movement she eluded his embrace and rose to her feet. She kept him off with a little gesture. "No, no, Martin, there's been enough foolishness for one night." But Martin, man at last, caught her and crushed her to him with his young strength and kissed her, not as worshipper kisses goddess, but as a man kisses a woman. At last she said, like millions of her sisters in similar circumstances, "You're hurting me." Like millions of his brethren, he released her. She panted for a moment. Then she said, "We must go in. Let me go first. Give me a few minutes' grace. Good night." Mortal gentleman and triumphant lover could do no more or no less. She sped down the terrace and disappeared. He waited, his soul aflame. When he entered the lounge, she was not there. He saw the Dangerfields and the Watney Holcombs and one or two others sitting in a group over straw-equipped glasses. He knew that Lucilla was not in the dancing-room. He knew that she had fled to solitude. Cheery Watney Holcomb, catching sight of him, waved an inviting hand. Martin, longing for the sweet loneliness of the velvet night, did not dare refuse. His wits were sharpened. Refusal would give cause for intolerable gossip. He came forward. "What have you done with Lucilla?" cried Mrs. Dangerfield. "She's gone to bed. We've had a heavy day. She's dead beat," said Martin. And thus he entered into the kingdom of the men of the world. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of The Wonderful Year by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 20. The next morning, Martin, inquiring for Miss Meryton, learned that she had already started on a sketching excursion with Hassan, the old one-eyed dragoman. Her destination was unknown, but the fact that Hassan had taken charge of a basket containing luncheon augured a late return. Martin spent a sorry forenoon at Karnak, which, deprived of the vivifying influence of the only goddess that had ever graced its precincts, seemed dead, forlorn, and vain. It was a day, too, of Khamsin, when hot stones and sand are an abomination to the gasping and perspiring sense. And yet Lucilla had gone off into the desert. She would faint at her easel. She would get sunstroke. She would be brought back dead. And anxious Martin joined a languid luncheon table. There was talk of the absent one. If she had not been Lucilla, they would have accounted her mad. He sat through the sweltering afternoon on the eastern terrace over a novel which he could not read. Last night he had held her passionately in his arms. Her surrender had been absolute. Her surrender had been absolute and eloquent avowal. Already the masculine instinct of possession spoke. Why did she now elude him? He had counted on a morning of joy that would have eclipsed the night. Why had she gone? Deep thought brought comforting solution. Tomorrow they were to migrate to Assouan. This was their last day in Luxor, where up to now Lucilla had not made one single sketch. Now had she not told him in Brantôme that her object in going to Egypt was to paint it? Generously she put aside her art for his sake, until the last moment. Of this last moment she was taking advantage. Still, why not a little word to him? He turned to his book, but the thrill of the great kiss pulsated through his veins. He gave himself up to dreams. Later in the afternoon, Watney Holcombe, fly-whisk in one hand and handkerchief in the other, took him into the cool, darkened bar, and supplied him with icy drink, and told him tales of his early days in San Francisco. A few other men lounged in and joined them. Desultory talk furnished an excuse for systematic imbibing of cold liquid. When Martin reached the upper air, he found that Lucilla had already arrived and had gone to her room for rest. He only saw her when she came down late for dinner. She was dressed in a close-fitting charmeuse gown of a strange blue shade like an Egyptian evening. Her pleasant greeting differed no whit from that of 24 hours ago. Not by the flicker of a brown eyelash did she betray recollection of last night's impassioned happenings. She talked of her excursion to the eager and reproachful group. A sandstorm had ruined a masterpiece, her best brushes, her hair, and old Hassan's temper. She had swallowed half Sahara with her food. Her very donkey, cocking round an angry eye, had called her the most opprobrious term in his vocabulary, an ass. Altogether she had enjoyed herself immensely. "You ought to have come, Martin," she said coolly. He made the obvious retort. "You did not give me the chance." "If only you'd been up at dawn," she laughed. "I was," he replied. "I lay awake most of the night, and I saw the sunrise from my bedroom window." "Oh dear," she sighed. "You were looking the wrong way. You were adoring the east while I was going out to the west." "All that is very pretty, but I'm dying of hunger," said Watney Holcombe, carrying her off to the dining-room. The rest followed. At a table she sat between her captor and Dangerfield, so that Martin had no private speech with her. After dinner, Watney Holcombe and Dangerfield wandered off to the bar to play billiards. Martin, declining an invitation to join them, remained with the four ladies in the lounge. Lucilla had manoeuvred herself into an unassailable position between the two married women. Martin and Maisie sat sketchily on the outskirts behind the coffee-table. The band discoursed unexhilarating music. Talk languished. At last Maisie sprang to her feet and took Martin unceremoniously by the arm. "If I sit here much longer I shall sob. Come on out and do something." Martin rose. "What can we do?" "Anything. We can gaze at the stars, and you can swear that you love me, or we can go and look at Cook's steamboat." "Will you come with us, Lucilla?" asked Martin. She shook her head and smiled. "I'm far too tired and lazy." The girl, still holding his arm, swung him round. He had no choice but to obey. They walked along the quay as far as the northern end of the temple. By the time of their return, Lucilla had gone to bed. She had become as elusive as a dream. He did not capture her till the next morning on the railway station platform, before their train started. By a chance of which he took swift advantage, she stood some paces apart from the little group of friends. He carried her further away. Moments were precious. He went at once to the root of the matter. "Lucilla, why are you avoiding me?" She opened wide eyes. "Avoiding you, my dear Martin?" "Yesterday you gave me no opportunity of speaking to you. This morning it has been the same, and I've been in a fever of longing for a word with you." "I'm sorry," she said. "And now you have me, what is the word?" "I love you," said Martin. "Hush," she whispered, with an involuntary glance round at the red-jerseyed porters and the stray passengers. "This is scarcely the place for a declaration." "The declaration was the night before last." "Hush," she said again, and laid her gloved hand on his arm. But he insisted. "You haven't forgotten?" "Not yet. How could I? You must give me time." "For what?" he asked. "To forget." A horrible pain shot through him. "Do you want to forget all that has passed between us?" She raised her eyes frankly and laughed. "My dear boy, how can we go into such intimate matters among this rabble?" "Oh, my dear," said Martin, "I am only asking a very simple question. Do you want to forget?" "Perhaps not quite," she replied softly, and the pain through his heart ceased, and he held up his head and laughed, and then bent it towards her and asked forgiveness. "If I didn't forgive you, I suppose you'd be miserable?" "Abjectly wretched," he declared. "That wouldn't be a fit frame of mind for a 6 hours stifling and dusty railway journey. So let us be happy while we can." At Assuan they went to the hotel on the little green island in the middle of the Nile. In the hope of her redeeming a half-promise of early descent before dinner, he dressed betimes and waited in the long lounge, his eyes on the lift. She appeared at last, fresh, radiant, as though she had stepped out of the dawn. She sat beside him with an adorable suggestion of intimacy. "Martin," she said, "I want you to make me a promise. Will you?" His eyes on hers, he promised blindly. "Promise me to be good while we're here?" "Good?" he queried. "Yes, don't you know what good means? It means not to be tempestuous or foolish or inquisitive." "I see," said Martin with a frown between his brows. "I mustn't—" he hesitated. "I mustn't do what I did the other night, and I mustn't say that all my universe, earth and sun and moon and stars are packed in this." His fingers met the drapery of her bodice in a fugitive, delicate touch. "And I mustn't ask you any questions about what you may be thinking." There was a new tone in his voice, a new expression in his eyes and about the corners of his lips, all of which she was quick to note. She cast him a swift glance of apprehension, and her smile faded. "You set out the position with startling concreteness." "I do," said he. "Up to a couple of days ago I worshipped you as a divine abstraction. The night before last, things, to use your words, became startlingly concrete. You are none the less wonderful and adorable, but you have become the concrete woman of flesh and blood I want, and would sell my soul for—" She glanced at him again, anxiously, furtively, half afraid. In such terms do none but masterful men speak to women, men who from experience of a deceitful sex know how to tear away ridiculous veils, or else men who, having no knowledge of woman whatever, suddenly awaken with primitive brutality to the sex instinct. Her subtle brain worked out the rapid solution. Her charming idea of making a man of Martin had succeeded beyond her most romantic expectations. She realized that facing him dry and cold, as she was doing now, would only develop a dramatic situation which would be cut uncomfortably short by the first careless friend who stepped out of the lift. She temporized, summoning the smile to her eyes. "Anyway, you've promised." "I have," said Martin. "You see, you can't stand with a pistol at my head whenever we meet alone. You must give me time." "To forget?" "To make up my mind whether to forget or remember," she declared radiantly. "Now, what more do you want an embarrassed woman to say?" Swiftly she had reassumed command. Martin yielded happily. "If it isn't all I want," said he, "it's much more than I dared claim." She rose, and he rose too. She passed her hand through his arm. "Come and see whether anybody has had the common sense to reserve a table for dinner." Thus, during her royal pleasure, their semi-lover-like relations were established. Rather, perhaps, were they nicely balanced on a knife-edge, the equilibrium depending on her skill. As at Luxor, so at Assuan did they the things that those who go to Assuan do. They lounged about the hotel garden. They took the motor ferry to the little town on the mainland and wandered about the tiny bazaar. They sailed on the Nile. They went to the merriest race meetings in heathendom, where you can back your fancy in camel, donkey, or buffalo for a shilling upwards at the state Paris Mutuel. They made an expedition to the dam. The main occupation, as it is of that of most who go to Assuan, was not to pass the time, but to sit in the sun and let the time pass. A golden fortnight or so slipped by. Martin lived as freely in his goddess's company as he had done at Cairo or Luxor. She had ordained a period of probation. All his delicacy of sentiment proclaimed her justified. She comported herself as the most gracious of divinities, and the most warmly sympathetic of human women, leading him by all the delicate devices known to Olympus and to Clapham Common to lay bare to her his inmost soul. He told her all that he had to tell, much that he had told already. His childhood in Switzerland, his broken Cambridge career, his life at Margate's Universal College, his adventures with Corinna, his waiterdom at Brantôme, his relations with Fortinbras, Bigoudin, Felice. The only thing in his simple past that he hid was his knowledge of the tragedy in the life of Fortinbras. "And then you came," said he, "and touched my dull earth, and turned it into a new Jerusalem of pure gold like unto clear glass." And he told her of his consultation with the dealer in happiness, and his journey to London, and his meeting with Corinna in the flimsy flat. It seemed to him that she had the divine power of taking his heart in her blue-veined hands and making it speak like that of a child. For everything in the world for which that heart had longed, she had the genius to create expression. In spite of all the delicious intimacy of such revelation, he observed his compact loyally. For the quivering moment it was enough that she knew and accepted his love. It was enough to realize that when she smiled on him, she must remember unresentfully the few holy seconds of his embrace. And yet, when alone with her, in the moonlit garden, so near that accidental touch of arm or swinging touch of skirt or other delicate physical sense of her was an essential part of their intercourse, he wondered whether she had a notion of the madness that surged in his blood, of the tensity of the grip in which he held himself. And so, lotus-eating, reckless of the future, happy only in the throbbing present, he remained with Lucilla and her friends at Assouan until the heat of spring drove them back to Cairo. There, on the terrace of Shepherds, on the noon of his arrival, he found Fortinbras. The dealer in happiness, economically, personally, though philosophically conducted, had also visited Luxor and had brought away a rich harvest of observation. He bestowed it liberally on Martin, who, listening with perplexed brow, wondered whether he himself had brought away but chaff. After a while Fortinbras inquired, "And the stock we wot of is still blooming?" Martin said, "I've been inconceivably happy. Don't let us talk about it." Presently Lucilla and Mrs. Dangerfield joined them, and Fortinbras was carried off to the Semirami to lunch. It was a gay meal. The Watney Holcombs had gathered in a few young soldiers, and youth asserted itself joyously. Fortinbras, urbane and debonair, laughed with the youngest. The subalterns, thinking him a personage of high importance who was unbending for their benefit, paid him touching deference. He exerted himself to please, dealing out happiness lavishly. Yet his bland eyes kept keen watch on Martin and Lucilla, sitting together on the opposite side of the great round table. Once he caught and held her glance for a few seconds. Then she flushed, as it seemed angrily, and flung him an irrelevant question about Felice. When the meal was over and he had taken leave of his hosts, he said to Martin, who accompanied him to the west door by which he elected to emerge, "Either you will never want me again, or you will want a friendly hand more than you have wanted a friendly hand in your life before, and I am leaving this land of enchantment the day after tomorrow. Dulce est dissipere, etc. But dissipation is the thief of professional advancement. If a dealer in cheaper and shoddier happiness arises in the quartier, I am lost. There was already, before I left, a conscientious and conscienceless Teuton who was trying to steal my thunder and retail it at the ignominious rate of a franc a reverberation. I cannot afford to let things drift. Neither, my son," he tapped the young man impressively on the shoulder, "neither can you." Martin straightened himself, half resentful, and twirled his trim moustache. "It's all very well, my son," said Fortinbras with his benevolent smile, "but all the let-hell-come airs in the world can't do anything else but intensify the fact that you're a soldier of fortune. Faint heart, you know the jingle, and faintness of heart is not the attribute of a soldier. Good-bye, my dear Martin." He held out his hand. "You will see me tomorrow at our usual haunt." Fortinbras waved adieu. Martin lit a cigarette and sat in a far corner of the veranda. The westering sun beat heavily on the striped awning. Further along by the door, a small group of visitors were gathered around an Indian jugular. For the first time almost since his landing in Egypt, he permitted himself to think. A soldier of fortune. The words conveyed sinister significance, a predatory swashbuckler in search of any fortune to his hand. Lucilla's fortune. Hitherto he had blinded himself to sordid considerations. He had dived, figuratively speaking, into his bag of sovereigns, as into a purse of Fortunatus. The magic of destiny would provide for his material wants. What to him, soul-centred on the ineffable woman, were such unimportant and mean preoccupations? He had lived in his dream. He had lived in his intoxication. He had lived of late in the splendour of a seismic moment. And now, crash, he came to earth. A soldier of fortune, an adventurer, a swindler. The brutal common-sense aspect grinned in his face. On shipboard, Fortinbras had warned him that he was an adventurer. He had not heeded. He was a soldier of fortune. He must strike the arm while it was hot. That was what Fortinbras meant. He must secure the heiress. He hated Fortinbras. The sudden realization of his position devastated his soul. And yet he loved her. He desired her as he had not dreamed it to be in a man's power to desire. At last his glance rested on the little crowd around the Indian juggler, and then suddenly he became aware of her flashing like a dove among crows. Her lips and eyes were filled with a child's laughter at the foolish conjuring. When the trick was over, she turned, and seeing him, smiled. He beckoned. She complied with the afterglow of amusement on her face, but when she came near him, her expression changed. "Why, what's the matter?" she asked. He pushed a chair for her. They sat. "I must speak to you once and for all," he said. "Don't you think it's rather public?" "The Indian is going," he replied, with an indicating gesture, "and the people too. It's too hot for them to sit out here." "Then what about me?" she asked. He sprang to his feet with an apology. She laughed. "Never mind. We are as well here as anywhere. Sit down. Now, why this sudden tragic resolution?" "An accidental word from Fortinbras. He called me a soldier of fortune. The term isn't pretty. You are a woman of great wealth. I am a man practically penniless. I have no position, no profession. I am what the world calls an adventurer." She protested. "That's nonsense. You've been absolutely honest with me from first to last." "Honest in so far as I've not concealed my material situation. But honourable? If you'd known in Brantôme that I'd already dared to love you, would you have suggested my coming to Egypt?" "Possibly not," replied Lucilla, the shadow of an ironical smile playing about her lips. "But we can be quite frank. I don't see how you could have told me." "Of course I couldn't," he admitted. "But loving you as I did, I ought not to have come. It was not the part of an honourable man." His elbow on the arm of the cane chair and his chin on his hand, he looked with haggard questioning into her eyes. She held his glance for a brief moment, then looked down at her blue-veined hands. "You see," he said, "you don't deny it. That's why I call myself an adventurer." Her eyes still downcast, she said, "You have no reason in the world to reproach yourself. As soon as you could, with decency, tell me that you loved me, you did. And you made it clear to me long before you told me. And I don't think," she added in a low voice, "that I showed much indignation." "Why didn't you?" he asked. She intertwined her fingers nervously. "Sometimes a woman feels it good to be loved, and I've felt it good and wonderful all the time. Once there was a man, years ago, but he's dead. Since then other men have come along, and I've turned them down as gently as I could. But no one has done the mad thing that you have done for my sake. And no one has been so simple and loyal and strong. You are different. I've had the sense of being loved by a man pure and unstained. God knows you are without blame." "Then, my dear," said he, bending his head vainly so as to catch her face otherwise than in profile, and to meet the eyes hidden beneath the adorable brown lashes, "what is to happen between us two?" For answer she made a little despairing gesture. "If I had the right of an honest man seeking a woman in marriage," he said, I would take matters into my own hand. I would follow you all over the world until I won you, somehow or the other. She turned on him in a flash of passion. If you say such things, you will make me marry you out of humiliation and remorse. God forbid I should do that, said Martin. She averted her head again. There was a span of silence. At the extreme end of the long deserted veranda, beneath the sun-baked awning, with only the occasional clatter of a carriage or the whir of a motor breaking the stillness of this drowsy embankment of the Nile, they might have been miles away in the desert solitude, under the palm tree of Fortinbras's dream. Lucilla was the first to speak. It is I who am to blame for everything. No, let me talk. I've got the courage to talk straight, and you've got the courage to listen. You interested me at Brantôme. Your position there was so un-English. Of course I liked you. I thought you ought to be roused from stagnation. It was just idle fancy that made me talk about Egypt. I thought it would do you good to cut everything and see the world. When I took Felice away with me and saw how she expanded and developed, I thought of you. I've done the same often before with girls like Felice, who have never been given a chance, and it has been a fascinating amusement. I've never made the experiment with a man. I wanted to see how you would shape, what kind of impression all the new kind of life would make on you. I realize it now, but till now I haven't, that all my so-called kindness to girls have been heartless experimenting. I could keep 20 girls in luxury for 20 years without considering the expense. That's the curse of unlimited money. One abuses its power. With you, of course, money didn't come in. I hadn't the insanity to ask you to be my guests, as I could ask young women. But money aside, I knew I could give you what I gave them. And from what Felice let drop, I gathered you had some little private means. So I wrote to you, on the off chance. I thought you would come. People have a way of doing what I ask them. You were going to be the most fascinating amusement of all. You see, that's how it was. She paused. His face hardened. Well, said he, go on. Can't you guess the rest? No, said he, I can't. There was a note in his voice that seemed to tear her heart. She pressed both hands to her eyes. You knew how I despise and hate myself. No, no, my dear, said Martin. He touched her shoulder, warm and soft. Only the convention of a diaphanous flimsy sleeve gave sanction. She let his hand remain there for a moment or two, then gripped it and flung it away. But the nervous clasp of her fingers denied resentment. She turned a white face. I knew you loved me. It was good, as I've told you, to feel it. I meant to escape as I've escaped before. I don't excuse myself. Then came the night at Luxor. I let myself go. It was a thing of the senses. Something snapped, as it has done in the case of millions of women under similar conditions. You could have done what you liked with me. I shall never forget it if I live to be 90. Do you think I've been sleeping peacefully all these nights ever since? I haven't. She looked at him defiantly. Said Martin, You must care for me a little. The veriest little is all I dare ask for. No, it isn't, she answered, meeting his eyes. Don't delude yourself. You are asking for everything. And if I had everything to give, I would give it to you. You may think I have played with you heartlessly for the last 3 or 4 weeks. Any outsider knowing the bare facts would accuse me. Perhaps I ought to have sent you away, but I haven't the strength. There, that's a confession. Make what you will of it. All I can make of it, said Martin tremulously, is that you're the woman for me and that you know it. I do, she said. I'm up against facts, and I face them squarely. On the other hand, you're not the man for me. If ever a woman has tried to love a man, I've tried to love you. That's why I've made you stay. I've plucked my heart out, all but the roots. There's a dead man there, at the roots. She flung out both hands, and her shoulders heaved. And he is always up between us, and I can't. It's no use. I must give myself altogether, or not at all. I'm not built for the half-and-half things." He sat grim, feeling more a stone than a man. She clutched his arm. "Suppose I did marry you? By all the rules of the game, I ought to. But it would only be misery for both of us. There will be 20,000 causes for misery. Don't you see?" "I see everything," said Martin. He rose and leaned both elbows on the veranda and faced her with bent brows. "I see everything. You put your case very clearly. But suppose I say that you hadn't played the game. Suppose I say that you should have known that no man who wasn't in love with you, except an imbecile, would have followed you to Egypt as I've done. Suppose I say that you've played havoc with my life. Suppose I instance everything that has passed between us, and I assert the rules of the game, and I ask you as a man, shaken to his centre with love of you, to marry me. What would you say?" She rose and stood beside him, holding her head very proudly. "Put upon my honour like that," she replied, "I should have to say yes." He took both her hands in his and raised them to his lips. "That's all I want to know. But as I don't reproach you, I'm not going to ask you, my dear. If I were lord of the earth, or a millionth part of the earth, I would laugh and take the risk. But as things are, I can't accept your generosity. You are the woman I love and shall always love. Goodbye, and God bless you." He wrung her hand and marched down the veranda, his head in the air, looking a very gallant fellow. After a few seconds' perplexity, she ran swiftly in pursuit. "Martin!" she cried. He turned and awaited her approach. "I feel I've behaved to you like the lowest of women. I'll make amends if you like. I'll marry you. There!" Martin stood racked with the great temptation. All his senses absorbed her beauty and her wonder. At length he asked, "Do you love me?" "I've told you all about that." "Then you don't. Yes or no, it's a matter of 2 lives. "I've tried, and I will try again." "But yes or no," he persisted. "No," she said. Again he took her hands and kissed them. "That ends it. If I married you, my dear, I should indeed be a soldier of fortune, and you would have every reason to despise me. Now it is really good-bye." Her gaze followed him until he disappeared into the hotel. Then she moved slowly to the balustrade, baking in the sunshine, and, leaning both elbows on it, stared through a blur of tears at the detested beauty of the world. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of The Wonderful Year by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 21. Fortinbras paced the deck of the homeward-bound steamer, deep in thought. He still wore the costume of the elderly cabinet minister, but his air was that of the cabinet minister returning to a wrecked ministry. His broad shoulders were rounded and bent. His face had fallen from its benevolent folds into fleshy haggardness. He felt old. He felt inexpressibly lonely. He had not repeated the social experiment of the voyage out. Save to his Dutch and Russian table neighbours, he had not the heart to speak to anyone. A deep melancholy enwrapped him. After his philosophical communication with the sage Abu Muhammad, he shrank from platitudinous commerce with the profane. It was for the heart and not for the mind that he craved companionship. He was travelling, second class for economy's sake, back to the old half-charlatan life. For all one's learning and wisdom, one cannot easily embark on a new career in the middle 50s. He must be Marchand de Bonheur to the end. He wondered whether he would miss Cécile. Such things had happened. No matter how degraded, she had been a human thing to greet him on his return from his preposterous toil. Also, her needs had been an incentive. They had sharpened the hawk's vision during the daily round of cafes and restaurants, and quickened his pounce upon the divined 5-franc piece. Would he have the nerve, the unwearied patience, the bitter sense of martyrdom, wherewith to carry on his trade? Again, in days past, his heavy heart had been uplifted by the love of a child, like the wild flowers from which alpine honey is made, away in the depths of old-world France. But now he had forfeited her love. She had written to him all these weeks in Egypt, dutifully, irreproachably, had given him the news, such as it was, of Brantôme. She had told him of the state of her uncle's health, invariably robust, of the arrivals and departures of elegant motorists, of the march through the town decorated for the occasion of a host of petits soldats, amid the enthusiasm and Marseillaise singing of the inhabitants, of the sudden death by apoplexy of the good Madame Chauvet, and the sudden development of business on the part of her daughters, who almost immediately had taken the next shop and launched out into iron wreaths and crosses and artificial flowers and funeral inscriptions, touching and pious, of the purchases of Greece, of the infatuation of the elderly Euphemie for the youthful waiter, erstwhile plongeur of the Café de l'Univers, of all sorts and conditions of unimportant happenings. Finally, of the betrothal of Monsieur Lucien Vidot and Estelle Mazabois, the daughter of the famous Mazabois who kept a great drapery establishment at Bédigeau. She has the diary of a princess and the head of a rocking horse, so they are sure to be happy, wrote Félix. The manner of this last announcement shocked him. Félix had changed. She had given him all the news, but her letters had grown self-conscious and artificial. To avoid the old, artless expressions of endearment, she rushed into sprightly narrative, and signed herself his affectionate daughter. He had lost Félix. Yes, he felt old and lonely, unnerved for the struggle. Even Martin had forsaken him. He had encountered a stony-faced, wrong-headed young man on the terrace of Shepherd's Hotel the noon before he sailed, and found all his nostrums for happiness high-handedly rejected. Martin had been an idle woman's toy, a fiery toy as it turned out, and when she burnt her fingers, she had dropped him. So much was obvious. Most of it he had foreseen. He had counted on eventual declaration and summary dismissal, but he had not reckoned on a prelude of reciprocated sentiment. Contrary to habit, Martin gave him but a confused view of his state of mind. The unhappy lover would hear not a word against his peerless lady. On the other hand, his love for her had blasted his existence. This appalling fact, that he did not proclaim it so heroically, he allowed Fortinbras to apprehend. He neither reproached him for past advice nor asked for new. To the suggestion that he should return to Brantôme and accept Bigourdin's offer, he turned a deaf ear. He had cut himself adrift. He must go whithersoever winds and tides should carry him, and they were carrying him far from Périgord. In what direction? Fortinbras had inquired. Thank heaven I don't know myself, he had answered. Anyhow, I'm going to seek my fortune. I must have money and power so that I can snap my fingers at the world. That's what I'm going to live for. And soon after that declaration, he had wrung Fortinbras by the hand, and, hailing an arabaya, had driven off into the unknown. Fortinbras had felt like the hen who sees her duckling brood sail away down the brook. He had lost control of his disciple. He mattered nothing to the young man setting forth on his wild goose chase after fortune. His charming little scheme had failed. He anticipated the reproaches of Bigourdin, the accusation in the eyes of Félix. Why did you side with the enemy? Why did you drive Martin away? He felt old and lonely, a pathetic failure. So he walked to the second-class desk with listless shoulders and bowed head, his hands in his pockets. Tiens, Monsieur Fortinbras, who would have thought it? Cried a fresh voice. He looked up and saw a dark-eyed girl, her head enveloped in a motor veil, who extended a friendly hand. Mademoiselle, he began uncertainly. Mais oui, Eugénie Dubois. You must remember me. There was also Le Grand Jules Massat. Yes, I remember, he said courteously with a wan smile. You saved us both from a petty mess. I remember the saving, but I forget the mess. It is my rule always to forget such things. She laughed gaily, burst into an account of herself. She was a modiste in the great Paris firm of Odile et Compagnie, which had a branch at Cairo. Now she was recalled for the Paris and London season. Et justement, she plucked at his sleeve and led him to a seat, I am in the tangle of an affair which keeps me awake of nights. You fall upon me from the skies like an angel. be good and give me a consultation?" She fished out her purse and extracted a 25-piastre piece. He motioned her hand away. "Mon enfant," said he, "you are an honourable little soul, but I don't do business on holiday. Raconte-moi ton affaire." But she protested. She would not abuse his kindness, either a consultation at the regulation price or no consultation at all. At last he said, "Eh bien, give me your 5 francs." She obeyed. He rose. "Come," said he, and led the way to the stairhead by the saloon where was fixed the collecting box in aid of the Fund for Shipwrecked Mariners. He slipped the coin down the slot. "Now," said he, "honour is satisfied." But listening to her artless and complicated tale, he wondered, while a shiver ran over his frame, whether he would ever be able again to slip a 5-franc piece into his waistcoat pocket. He felt yet older than before, incapable of piercing to the root of youth's perplexities. He counselled with oracular vagueness, conscious of not having earned his fee. He paced the deck again. "Were it not for Abu Mohammed," he said, "I should call it a disastrous journey." Meanwhile, Martin, lonelier even than he, sat in the bows of a great eastward-bound steamer, his eyes open to the staring facts of life. No longer must he masquerade as the man of fashion, never again until he had bought the right. The remains of his small capital he must keep intact for the day of need. No more the luxury of first-class travel. This voyage in the steerage was but a means of transit to the new lands where he would win his way to fortune. He needed no advice. He had spiritually and morally outgrown his tutelage. No longer, so he told himself, would he nourish his soul on dreams. He could feed, if it liked, on memories. The madness had passed. He drew the breath of an honest man. If he had taken Lucilla at her word and married her, what would have been his existence? Trailing about the idle world in the wake of a rich wife, dependent on her bounty even for a pair of shoelaces, eating out his heart for the love she could not give. At last, perhaps, quarrelling desperately, or else with sapped willpower, sunk in sloth, accepting from her an allowance on condition that they should live apart. He had heard of such marriages since he had mingled with the wealthy. Even had she met him with a love as passionate as his own, would the happiness have lasted? In his grim mood, he thought not. He reasoned himself into the conviction that his loss had been his gain. Far better that he should be among these few poor folk who sat down to table in their shirt-sleeves, than that he should be eating the flesh-pots of dishonour in the land of Egypt. He himself dined in his shirt-sleeves, as he had done many a time before in the kitchen of the Hôtel des Grottes. Yet he hungered for her. It seemed impossible that he should never see her again, never again watch the sweep of the adorable brown eyelashes, the subtle play of laughter around her mobile lips, never again greet with delicious heart-pang the sight of her slim figure, willowy like those in the Primavera. In vain he schooled himself to regard her as one dead. The witchery of her obsessed him night and day. He learned what it was to suffer. He had taken his deck passage to Hong Kong. Why, he could scarcely tell. It sounded very far away from her as practicable. As the sultry days went on, he realized that he had not reckoned on the tremendous distance of Hong Kong. It was past Bombay, Colombo, Penang, and Singapore. At such ports as he could, he landed, but the glamour of the East had gone. He was a man who had expended his power of wonder and delight. He looked on them coldly as places he might possibly exploit, should Hong Kong prove barren. Also, the period of great heat had begun, and he found danger in strolling about the deadly streets. On shipboard, he slept on deck. As they neared Hong Kong, his heart sank. For the first time he wished that Fortinbras were with him. Perhaps he had repaid affection with scant courtesy. He occupied himself with a long letter to his friend, setting out his case. He then imagined the reply. "My son," said the mellow, persuasive voice, "have you not been carrying on from thrill to thrill the great adventure begun last August, when you threw off the chains of Margate? Have you not filled your brain and your soul with new and breathless sensations? Have you not tasted joy hitherto unimagined? Have you not been admitted to the heart of a great and loyal nation? Have you not flaunted it in the dazzling splendour of the great world? Have you not steeped your being in the gorgeous colour of the East? Have not your pulses throbbed with an immortal passion for a woman of surpassing beauty? Have you not known, what is only accorded to the select of the sons of men, a supreme moment of delirious joy when time stood still and space was not? Have you not lived intensely all this wonderful year? Are you the same blank-minded, starving-souled, mild negation of a man who sat as a butt for Corinna's pleasantries at the Petit Cornichon? Have you not progressed immeasurably? Have you not gained spiritual stature, wisdom both human and godlike? And are you not now, having passed through the fiery furnace, not only unscathed but tempered, setting out on the still greater adventure, the conquest of the ends of the earth? Less than a year ago, what were you but a slave? What are you now? A free man. So through the ears of fancy ran the sonorous rhetoric of Fortinbras. Martin tore up his letter and scattered the fragments on the sea. A day or two afterwards, with a stout heart, he landed at Victoria, the capital of Hong Kong. A half-caste clerk to whom he had entrusted his card returned from the inner office. Mr. Tudley will see you, sir." Martin followed him into a darkened office, cooled by an electric fan, where a white-clad, gaunt, yellow-faced Englishman sat at a desk. The clerk closed the door and retired. The yellow-faced Englishman rose and smiled, after glancing at Martin's card on the desk before him. "Mr. Overshaw, what can I do for you?" "You can give me some work," said Martin. "I'm afraid I can't." "I'm sorry," said Martin. "I must apologize for troubling you." He was about to withdraw. Mr. Tudsley glanced at him shrewdly. "Wait a minute. Sit down. I don't seem to place you. Who are you, and where do you come from?" "That's my name," said Martin, pointing to his card, "and I've just arrived from Europe, or to be more exact, from Egypt." "By the Sesostris?" "Yes." Mr. Tudsley took up and scanned a typewritten sheet of paper. "I don't see your name on the passenger list." "Possibly not," said Martin. "I came steerage." "Indeed?" Martin, spruce in his well-cut grey flannels, looked anything but a deck passenger. "What made you do that?" "Economy," said Martin. "And why have you come to me?" "I made a list last night at the hotel of the leading firms in Hong Kong, and yours was among them." "Haven't you any introductions?" "No." "Then what induced you to come to this particular little hell upon earth?" "Chance," said Martin. "One place is pretty much the same to me as another." "What kind of work are you looking for?" "Anything from sweeping the floor to running a business." "Only coolies that sweep floors here," said Mr. Tudsley, tilting back his chair and clasping his hands behind his back. "And only experienced men of business run businesses. What business have you run?" "None," said Martin. "Well, what business qualifications have you?" "None, but I'm an educated man. Cambridge." Yes, one sees that," the other interrupted. "There are millions of them." "I'm bilingual, English and French. My German is good enough for ordinary purposes." "Do you know anything of accounts?" "No," said Martin. "Can you add up figures correctly?" "I dare say," said Martin. "Have you ever tried?" "No," said Martin. Mr. Tudsley handed him a mass of typewritten papers pinned together. "Do you know what that is?" Martin glanced through the document. "It seems to be a list of commodities." "It's a bill of lading. First time you've ever seen one?" "Yes," said Martin. "Have you any capital?" "Well, a little, a few £100. "Then stick to it like grim death. Don't part with it here." "I haven't the slightest intention of doing so," said Martin. The lean, yellow-faced man brought his chair back to normal perpendicularity and swung it round. It worked on a swivel. "Mr. Overshaw," said he, "pardon a perfect stranger giving you advice, but you seem to be a frank, straight man. You've made a mistake in coming to Hong Kong. It's a beast of a climate. In a few days' time the rains will begin, then it will rain steadily, drearily, hopelessly, damply, swelteringly, deadlily, day after day, hour after hour, for 4 months. That's one way of looking at things. There's another.
I'm perfectly sure there's not a vacancy for an amateur clerk in the whole of Hong Kong. If we want a linguist, your speciality, we can get Germans by the dozen who not only know 6 languages, but have been trained as business experts from childhood. And we can get them for 2 halfpenny a month. Martin, remembering the discussions at the Café de l'Univers, replied, And when the war comes? What war? Between England and Germany. My dear fellow, what in the world are you talking of? There's not going to be any war. Besides, he smiled indulgently, suppose there was. What then? First, said Martin, you would have given the enemy an intimate knowledge of your trade, which, by the way, he's even now reporting by every mail to his government. He was quoting the dictum of a highly placed Egyptian official whom he met at a dinner party in Cairo. And then you would have to fall back upon Englishmen. Mr. Tudsley laughed and rose so as to end the interview. I'll take the risk of that, he said easily. But the immediate question is, what are you to do? Have you visited any other firms? Several, said Martin. And what have they said? Much the same as you, Mr. Tudsley, only not so kindly and courteously. That's all right, said Mr. Tudsley, shy at the compliment. I don't see why Englishmen meeting at the other end of nowhere shouldn't be civil to each other. But my advice is, clear out of Hong Kong. There's nothing doing. What about Shanghai? That's further still from Europe. Singapore? That's better, on the way back. I must thank you, said Martin, for giving me so much of your time. Not a bit. I'm only sorry I can't give you a job or put you on to one. But you see the position, don't you? Martin smiled wryly. I'm beginning to see it with painful clearness. Goodbye, and good luck, said Mr. Tudsley. Goodbye, said Martin. Between then and the date of sailing of the next homeward-bound steamer, Martin knocked at every door in Hong Kong. Nobody wanted him. There was nothing he could do. There was no place for him on the very lowest rung of any ladder to fortune. He sailed to Singapore. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of The Wonderful Year by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 22. When Martin landed at Marseille, he found the world on the brink of war. He had spent the early summer roaming about the East, looking, as he had looked at Hong Kong, for work that might lead to fortune, and finding none. A touch of fever had caused a friendly doctor at Penang to pack him off to Europe by the first boat. It had been a will-o'-the-wisp chase, mainly in the rains, when the Straits settlements are not abodes of delight. It is bad enough that your boots should be mildewed every morning, but when the mildew begins to attack your bones, it is best to depart. Martin embarked philosophically. He had tried the East because it was nearer to his original point of departure. Now he would try the West, America or Canada. In a temperate climate he could undertake physical labour. His muscles were solid, and save for the touch of fever of which the sea air had soon cured him, his health was robust. He could hew wood, draw water, dig the earth. In a new country he could not starve. At the last pinch he could fall back on the profession he had learned at the Hôtel de Grotte. Furthermore, by eating the bread and choosing the couch of hardship, he had spent comparatively little of his capital. His vagabondage had hardened him physically and morally. He knew the world. He had mixed with all kinds and conditions of men. Egypt seemed a sensuous dream of long ago. He deafened his heart to its memories. It would take 10 years to make anything of a fortune. If he succeeded, then, in 10 years' time, he would seek Lucilla. In the meantime, he wouldn't waste away in despair. He faced the future with confidence. While standing with his humble fellow-passengers in the bows of the vessel, he felt his pulses thrill at the first sight of the blue islands of Marseille. It was France, country almost of his adoption. He rejoiced that he decided not to book his ticket to Southampton, but to pass through the beloved land once again before he sailed to another hemisphere. Besides, his money and most of his personal effects, dispatched from Egypt, were lying at Cook's office in Paris. The practical therefore turned sentiment into an easy channel. He landed, carrying his bag in his hand, bought a paper on the quay from a screaming urchin, and to his stupefaction found the world on the brink of war. At Gibraltar he had not seen a newspaper. None had penetrated to the steerage, and he had not landed. He had taken it for granted that the good, comfortable old earth was rolling its usual course. Now, at Marseilles, he became aware of everyone in the blazing sunshine of the quays staring at newspapers held open before them. At the modest hotel hard by where he deposited his bag, he questioned the manager. Yes, did he not know? Austria had declared war on Serbia. Germany had rejected all proposals from England for a conference. The President of the Republic had hurried from Russia. Russia would not allow Serbia to be attacked by Austria. France must join Russia. It was a coup prepared by Germany. "Ça y est, c'est la guerre," said he. Martin went out into the streets and found a place on the crowded terrace of one of the cafes on the Canebière. All around him was the talk of war. The rich-voiced Provençal did not speak in whispers. There was but one hope for peace, the successful intervention of England between Russia and Austria. But Germany would not have it. War was inevitable. Martin bribed a chasseur to find him some English papers, no matter of what date. With fervent anxiety he scanned the history of the momentous week. What he read confirmed the talk. Whatever action England might take, France would be at war in a few days. He paid for his drink and walked up the Canebière. He saw no smiling faces. The shadow of war already overspread the joyous town. A battalion of infantry passed by, and people stood still involuntarily and watched the soldiers with looks curiously stern. And Martin stood also, and remained standing long after the clanging tramcars temporarily held up had blocked them from his sight. And he knew that he could not go to America. In a little spot in the heart of France lived all the friends he had in the world, all the brave souls he had learned to love. Brantôme appeared before him as in a revelation, and a consciousness of ingratitude smote him so that he drew a gasping breath. Not that he had forgotten them. He had kept up a fitful correspondence with Bigourdin, who had never hinted a reproach. But until an hour or two ago he had been prepared to wipe Brantôme out of his life, to pass through France without giving it an hour of greeting, even an Ave atque vale. In the past 7 months of mad folly and studied poverty, where had he met characters so strong, ideals so lofty, hearts so loyal? What had he learned among the careless, superficial Anglo-American society in Egypt, comparable to that which he had learned in this world-forgotten little bourgeoisie in France? Which of them had touched his nature below the layer of his vanity? What ideals had he met with in the East? Could he so term the complacent and pessimistic opportunism of the Tudleys, the querulous grumbling of officials, the honest dullness of sea captains and seamen? He judged superficially, it is true, for one has to strike deep before one can get at the shy soul of a Briton. But a man is but the creature of his impressions. From his own particular journeyings of 7 months, he had returned almost bewilderingly alone. East of Marseilles there dwelt not a human being whose call, no matter how faint, sounded in his ears. England, in so far as intimate personal England was concerned, had no call for him either, nor had America, unknown, remote, unfriendly as Greenland. Jostled, he walked along the busy thoroughfare, a man far away, treading the paths of the spirit. In this mighty convulsion that threatened the earth, there was one spot which summoned him, with a call clear and insistent. His place was there, in Périgord, to share in its hopes and its fears, its mourning and its joy. He returned to the hotel for his bag, and took the first train in the direction of Brantôme. What he would do when arrived, he had no definite notion. It was something beyond reason that drove him thither, something irresistible, more irresistible than the force which had impelled him to Egypt. Then he had hesitated, weighed things for and against. Now one moment had decided him. It never occurred to him to question. Through the burning south of France he sped. As yet only the shadow of war hung over the land. The awful word had not yet gone forth. Swarthy men and women worked in the baking vineyards and gathered in the yellow harvest. But here and there, on flashing glimpses of white road, troops marched dustily, and military wagons lumbered along. And in the narrow, wooden-seated third-class carriage on the slow and ever-stopping train, the talk even of the humblest was of war. At every station some of the passengers left, some entered. There seemed to be a sudden concentration homewards. At every station the soldiers recalled from leave to their garrisons. These, during the journey, were questioned as authoritative functionaries. Yes, for sure there would be war. Why, they did not know, except that the sale bête of Germans were, at last, going to invade France. Said one, "I saw an officer yesterday in our village, the son of Monsieur le Comte de Bonheur, who has the big chateau là-bas. We have known each other from childhood. And he said, 'Ah, mon brave, ça y est.' And I said, 'What, mon lieutenant?' And he said, 'Voilà le son du canon. Fight like a good son of Bonheur, or I'll cut off your ears.' And I replied, 'Quasiment comme ça. You will not have the opportunity, mon lieutenant, you being in the artillery and I in the infantry.' And he laughed with good heart. 'Anyhow,' said he, 'if you return to the village when the war is over without the military medal and I am alive, I'll make my mother do it in the courtyard of the chateau with her own scissors.' I tell you this to prove to you that I know there is going to be war." And the women, holding their blue bundles on their knees in the crowded compartment, for in democratic France Demos is not allowed the luxury of luggage racks, looked at the future with anxious eyes. What would become of them? The government would take their men. Their men would be killed or maimed. Even if the men returned safe and sound, in the meantime, how would they live? Ah, mon Dieu, c'est féroce de guerre. They cursed the war, as though it were a foul and conscious entity. The interminable journey, by day, by night, with tedious waits at great ghostly junctions, at last was over. Martin emerged from the station of Brantôme, and immediately before him stood the familiar ramshackle omnibus of the Hôtel des Grottes. Old Grégoire, the driver, on beholding him, staggered back and almost fell over the step of the vehicle. "Monsieur Martin, c'est vous?" Recovering, he advanced with great sun-glazed hand. "Yes, it is indeed I," laughed Martin. "It is everybody that will be content," cried Grégoire. "How one has talked of you and wished you were back. And now that this Sacré-Cœur is coming." "That's why I've come," said Martin. "How are Monsieur and Mademoiselle?" Both were well. It was they who would be glad to see Monsieur Martin. The old fellow, red-faced, white-haired, clean-shaven, with a comfortable gash of a mouth, clapped him on the shoulder. "Mais voilà un solide gaillard. Tu trouves?" Why, of course Grégoire found him transformed into a stout fellow. When he had arrived a year ago, he was like a bit of wet string. What a thing it was to travel! And yet he had been in China where people ate rats and dogs, which could not be nourishing food. In a fortnight, on the good meat and foie gras of Périgord, he would develop into a veritable giant. If Monsieur Martin would enter, he held the door open. No one else had arrived by the train. The omnibus jolted and swayed along the familiar road, through the familiar cobble-paved streets, along the familiar quays, past many a familiar face. They all seemed to chant the welcome of which the old driver had struck the key. Martin felt strangely happy, and the tears were very near his eyes. Monsieur Richard, the butcher, catching sight of him, darted a pace or two down the pavement so as to make sure, and threw up both hands in greeting. And as they turned the corner of the hill surmounted by the dear grey tower of the old abbey, Monsieur le Curé saw him, and smiled, and swept a salute with his old dusty hat, which Martin acknowledged through the end window of the omnibus. They drew up before the familiar door of the old White Inn. Baptiste was there, elderly, battered, in his green baize apron. "Mais mon Dieu, c'est vous, mais—" He wrung Martin's hand, and, as once before on the return of Felice, not being able to cope with his emotions, he shouted on the threshold of the vestibule, Monsieur, c'est Monsieur Martin qui arrive." "Qu'est-ce que tu dis là?" cried a familiar voice from the bureau. "C'est Monsieur Martin." Martin entered, and in the vestibule encountered Bigourda. "Mais, mon vieux," cried the vast man, "c'est toi? C'est vraiment toi, enfin?" It was the instinctive, surprised, and joyous greeting of the two servants. Martin stood unstrung. What had he done to deserve it? Before he could utter a word, he felt 2 colossal arms swung round him and a kiss implanted on each cheek. Then Bigourda held him out and looked at him, and, like Grégoire, told him how solid he looked. "Enfin, you've come back. Tell me how and when and why. Tell me all." Martin's eyes were moist. "My God," said he with a catch in his voice, "you are a good fellow." "Not a bit, mon cher. We are friends, and in friendship there is something just a little bit sacred. But tell me, nom d'une pipe, all about yourself." "I was on my way," said Martin with his conscientious honesty, "from Penang to New York. At Marseille I heard for the first time of the war in which France will be involved, and of which we have so often talked. And something, I don't know what, called me here. Et moi voici." "C'est beau, c'est bien beau, tout à part," said Bigourda seriously. "Let us go and find Felice." Now, when a Frenchman characterizes a deed as beau, it is, in his opinion, very fine indeed. But before they could move, Euphemie rushed from her kitchen and all but embraced the wanderer, and Joseph, late plongeur at the Café de l'Univers and now waiter at the hotel, came shyly from the salle à manger, and the brightness of his eyes was only equalled by the lustre of the habiliments that formerly had belonged to Martin. Bigourda dispatched him in quest of Felice. Soon she came from the Fabrique, looking rather white. Joseph had shot his news at her. But she came up, looking Martin straight in the eyes, her hand extended. "Bonjour, Martin. I am glad to see you again." "So am I," said he. "More than glad. It's like coming back to one's own people." She drew up her little head and asked with a certain bravura, "How is Lucilla?" He winced, but he did not show it. He smiled. "I don't know. I haven't heard of her since March." "Neither have I," she said. "Not since January. She seems to be a bird of passage through other people's lives." Bigourda laughed, shaking a great forefinger. "I bet that is not original. I bet you are quoting your old philosopher of a father." She coloured and said defiantly, "Yes, I confess it. It is none the less true." "And how is the good Fortinbras?" asked Martin, to turn a distressful conversation. "Ah, mauvais. We are expecting him by any train. It is I who am making him come. Tomorrow I may be called out. France will want more than the troupes métropolitaines and the reserves to fight the Germans. They want the territorials. C'est moi, l'armée territoriale." He thumped his chest. "It was written that I should strike a blow for France like my father's. But while I am striking the blow, who is to look after my little Felice and the Hôtel des Grottes? It is well to be prepared. When the mobilization is ordered, there will be no more trains for civilians." "And what do you feel about the war, Felice?" asked Martin. She clenched her hands. "I would give my immortal soul to be a man," she cried. Bigourda hugged her. "That is a daughter of France. I am proud of our little girl. On dirait une Jeanne d'Arc. But where is the Frenchwoman now who is not animated by the spirit of La Pucelle d'Orléans?" "In the meanwhile, mon oncle," said Felice, disengaging herself demurely from his embrace, "Martin looks exceedingly dusty and hungry, and no one has even suggested that he should wash or eat or have his bag carried up to his room." Bigourda regarded her with admiration. "She is wonderful. She thinks of everything. Baptiste, take up Monsieur Martin's thing to the chambre d'honneur." "My dear fellow," Martin protested, "I only want my old room in which I have slept so soundly." But Bigourda would have none of it. He was the prodigal son. "Et justement," he cried, slapping his thigh, "we have a good calf's head for déjeuner." "Yes, it's true," he laughed delightedly. "The fatted calf. It was fatted by our neighbour Richard. C'est extraordinaire." So Martin shaved and washed in the famous bathroom, and changed and descended to the salle à manger. The only guests were a few anxious-faced commercial travellers at the centre table. All but one were old acquaintances. He went the round, shaking hands amid cordial greetings. It was the last time, they said. Tomorrow they would be mobilized. The day after they would exchange the sample box for the pack of the soldier. In a week they would have the skin torn off the soles of their feet, and in a month they would be blown to bits by shells. They proclaimed a lack of the warrior spirit, They had a horror of blood, even a cat's. It stirred up one's stomach. Mais enfin, one did not think of such unimportant things when France was in peril. If your house was in danger of being swept away by flood, there was no sense in being afraid to catch cold through having your feet wet. Each, in his way, expressed the same calm, fatalistic patriotism. They had no yearning to be killed, but if they were killed, they shrugged their shoulders. They were France, and France was they. No force could dismember them from France without France or themselves bleeding to death. It was very simple. Martin left them and sat down with Bigourdin and Felice at their table in the corner by the door. It was the first time he had ever done so. Felice ate little and spoke less. Now and again, as he told of his mild adventures in the Far East, he caught her great dark eyes fixed on him, and he smiled, unaccountably glad. But always she shifted her glance and made a pretence of eating or drinking. Once, when Bigourdin, called by innkeeper's business to one of the commercial travellers, had left the table, she said, "You have changed. One would say it was not the same man." "What makes you think so?" he laughed. "You talk differently. There is a different expression on your face." "I'm sorry," said he. "I don't see why you should be sorry," said Felice. "If you no longer recognize me," said he, they talked in French, "I must come to you as a stranger." She bit her lip and flushed. I did not know what I was saying. Perhaps it was impertinent." "How could it be, Felice?" he asked, bending across the table. "But if I have changed, is it for the better or the worse?" "Would you be a waiter here again?" Martin looked for a second into his soul. "No," said he. "Voilà," said Felice. "But I couldn't tell you why." "It's not necessary," said Felice. Bigourdin joined them. The meal ended. Felice went off to her duties. Bigourdin said, "Let us go and drink our coffee at the Café de l'Univers. Everybody is there at this hour the last day or two. We may learn some news." They descended the hill and walked along the blazing quays. Martin knew every house, every stone, every old woman who, pausing from beating her linen on the side of a dron, waved him a welcome. And men stopped him and slapped his shoulder and shook him by the hand. "You recognize the good heart of Périgord," said Bigourdin. Martin replied with excusable Gallic hyperbole, "C'est mon pays. I find it again after having wandered over the earth." They turned into the narrow, cool Rue de Périgueux. On the opposite side of the street they saw Monsieur Faure, agent du maire, walking furiously, mopping a red forehead, soft straw hat in hand. He sped across to them, too excited to realize that Martin had gone and was returned. "Have you heard the news? The mayor has received a telegram from Paris. The order of mobilization goes out today." "Bon," said Bigourdin. The terrace of the Café de l'Univers was crowded with the notables of the town, who, in their sober way, only frequented the café after dinner. The special coterie had their section apart, as at night. They were all assembled. Finis of the Compagnie du Gard, Boson, professor of the École Normale, the Villiers, father and son, Thibault, managing director of the quarries, Benoit of the railway, Rutilard, the great chandler of corn and hay, and they did not need the adjoint de maire to tell them the news. The fresh arrivals, provided speedily with chairs by the waiters, were swallowed up in the group. And Martin was assailed. "Et maintenant, l'Angleterre, qu'est-ce qu'elle va faire?" It was the question on all French lips that day until England declared war. And Martin proclaimed, as though inspired from Whitehall, that England would fight. For the moment his declaration satisfied them. The talk swayed from him excitedly. France, at war at last after 40 years, held their souls. They talked in the air, as men will, of numbers, of preparations, of chances, of the solidarity of the nation. When there was a little pause, the square-headed, white-haired Monsieur Villiers rose, and with a gesture imposed silence. "This is a moment," said he, "for every misunderstanding between loyal French hearts to be cleared up. We are now brothers in the defence of our beloved country. Mon brave ami Bigourdin, donne-moi Thomas." Bigourdin sprang up. in the public street, but what did that matter, and cried, "Mon vieux Virio!" And the two men embraced and kissed each other, and everyone, much affected, cried, "Bravo! Bravo!" And then Bigourda, reaching over the marble tables, took young Lucien Video's hands and embraced him and shook him by the shoulders and cried, "Here is a cuirassier who is going to cut through the Germans like bladders of lard." It was a memorable reconciliation. Fortinbras arrived late at night, probably by the last regular train services. For on the next day, and for many days afterwards, there were wild hurry and crowds and confusion on roads and railways all through France. Into the town poured all the men of the surrounding villages, and the streets were filled with them and their wives and mothers and children, and strange officers in motor cars whirled through the Rue de Périgueux. Bands of young men, falling into the well-remembered step, marched along the quays to the station, singing the Marseillaise, and women stood at their doorsteps, blowing them kisses as they passed. And at the station, the great military trains, adorned with branches of trees and flowers, steamed away, a massed line of white faces and waving arms, and old men and women, young and old, waved handkerchiefs until the train disappeared, and then turned away, weeping bitterly. Martin, Fortinbras, and Bigourda went to many a train to see off the flower of the youth of the little town. Lucien Video went gallantly. "A good war-horse suits me better than an office stool," he laughed. And Joseph, sloughing off forever Martin's shiny black raiment, went off too, and the younger waiters of the Café de l'Univers, and Bozo, the young professor at the École Normale, and the son of the adjoint, and Le Petit Moron, who helped his mother at the Débit de Tabac. Many a familiar face was carried away from Brantôme towards some unknown battle line of the thunder and the slaughter, a familiar face which Brantôme was never to see again. And after a day or two the town seemed futile, like a ballroom from which the last dancers had gone. Grave was the evening coterie at the Café de l'Univers. The rumour had gone through France that England more than hesitated. Fortinbras magnificently defended England's honour. He had been very quiet at home, tenderly shy and wistful with Felice, unsuggested of paths to happiness with Martin, his attitude towards intimate life one of gentle melancholy. He had told Martin that he had retired from business as Marchand de Bonheur. He had lost the trick of it. At Bigourda's urgency, he had purchased an annuity which sufficed his modest and philosophic needs. No longer having the fierce incentive to gain the hard-earned 5-franc piece, no longer involved in a scheme of things harmonious with an irregular profession, he was like the singer deprived of the gift of song, the telepathist stricken with inhibitory impotence. For all his odd learning, for all his garnered knowledge of the human heart, and for all his queer heroic struggle, he stood before his own soul an irremediable failure. So an older, and almost a broken Fortinbras had taken up his quarters at the Hôtel des Grottes. But, stimulated by the talk of war, he became once more the orator and the seer. He held a brief for England, and his passionate sincerity imposed itself on his hearers. "Thank God," said he afterwards, "I was right." But in the meanwhile, Martin, strung in every fibre to high pitch by what he had heard, by what he had seen, and by what he had felt, knew that just as it was ordained that he should come to Brantôme, so it was ordained that he should not stay. "You talk eloquently and with conviction, monsieur," said the mayor to Fortinbras. There were a dozen in the familiar café corner, tense and eager-eyed, and Monsieur Cazensac, the Gascon proprietor, stood by. "But what proof have you given us of England's cooperation?" Martin, with a thrill through his body, said in a loud voice, "Monsieur le Maire, there is not a living Englishman with red blood in his veins who has any doubt. I, the most obscure of Englishmen, speak for my country. Get me accepted as a volunteer, the humblest foot soldier, and I will fight for France. Take up my pledge, Monsieur le Maire. It is the pledge of the only Englishman in Brantôme on behalf of the British Empire. There are millions better than I from all ends of the earth who will be inspired by the same sentiments of loyalty. Get me accepted." In English, Martin could never have said it. Words would have come shyly. But he was among Frenchmen, attuned to French modes of expression. A murmur of approbation arose. "Yes," cried Martin. "I offer France my life as a pledge for my country. Get me accepted, Monsieur le Maire." The mayor, a lean, grey-eyed, bald-headed man with a straggling iron-grey beard, looked at him intently for a few moments. "C'est bien," said he. "I take up your pledge. I have to go tomorrow to Périgeau to see Monsieur le Préfet, who has a certain friendliness for me. He has influence with the Ministère de la Guerre. Accompany me to Périgeau. I undertake to see that it is arranged." "I thank you, Monsieur le Maire," said Martin. Then everybody talked at once, and lifted their glasses to Martin, and Monsieur Virio dispatched Cazensac for the sweet champagne in which nearly a year ago they had drunk Lucien's health, and Bigourdin embraced him, and when the wine was poured out there were cries of "Vive l'Angleterre! Vive la France! Vive Martin!" and the square-headed old Monsieur Virio set the climax of his ovation by lifting his glass at arm's length and proclaiming, "Vive notre bon Périgourdin!" Said Fortinbras, who sat next to him, "I would give the rest of my life to be as young as you just for the next few months. My God, you must feel proud." Martin's steady English blood asserted itself. "I don't," said he. "I feel a damned premature hero." It is only in the Légion étrangère, that fantastic, romantic regiment of daredevil desperadoes, capable of all iniquities and of all heroisms, that a foreigner can enlist straight away, no questions asked. To be incorporated in the regular army of France is another matter. Wires have to be pulled. They were pulled in Martin's case. It was to his credit that he had served 2 years, gaining the stripes of a corporal, in the Rifle Corps of the University of Cambridge. At the psychological moment of pulling, England declared war on Germany. The resources of the British Empire, men and money and ships and blood, were on the side of France. England and France were one. A second's consideration of the request of the Préfet de la Dordogne and a hurriedly scrawled signature constituted Martin a potential member of the French army. It happened that, when the notice of authorization came, the first person he ran across was Felice, by the door of the Fabrique. He waved the paper. "I'm accepted." She turned pale and put her hand to her heart, but she met his eyes bravely. "When do you go?" "At once, straight to Périgeau to enlist." "And when will you come back?" "God knows," said he. Then he became aware of her standing scared, with parted lips and heaving bosom. "Of course I hope to come back, sometime or other, when the war's over. Naturally, but—" she said quaveringly, "you may be killed." "So may millions. I take my chance." She turned aside, clapped both hands to her face, and broke into a passion of weeping. Instinctively he put an arm round her. She sobbed on his shoulder. He whispered, "Do you care so much about what happens to me?" She tore herself away and faced him with eyes flashing through her tears. "Do you think I'm a stick or a stone? I am half English, half French. You are going to fight for England and France. Don't you think women feel these things? You are a part of the Englishwoman and the Frenchwoman that is going out to fight, and I would hate you if you didn't fight. But I don't want you to be killed." She fled, and not till he left the Hôtel des Grottes did he see her again, alone. When with Bigourdin and Fortinbras he was about to enter the old omnibus to take him to the station, she pinned a tricolour ribbon on his coat, and then saying, "Goodbye, and God bless you," looked him squarely in the eyes. It was in his heart to say, "You're worth all the Lucillas in the universe." But there were Bigourdin and Fortinbras and Euphemie and Baptiste and Grégoire and the chambermaid and a few straggling girls from the Fabrique all standing by. He said, "God bless you, Felice. I shall never part with your ribbon as long as I live." Grégoire climbed to his seat. Bigourdin closed the door. The omnibus jolted and swayed down the road. The elfin figure of Felice was suddenly cut off at the turn. And that was the last of the Hôtel des Grottes. A week or so later, Martin, drilling in the hot barrack square, realized that just a year had passed since he first set eyes on Brantôme. A year ago he had been a spineless, aimless drudge at Margaret's Universal College. Now, wearing a French uniform, he was about to fight for France and England in the greatest of all wars that the world had seen. And during those 12 months, through what soul-shaking experiences had he not passed? Truly a wonderful year. "Mais vous, numéro 7, sacre nom de Dieu, qu'est-ce que vous faites là?" screamed the drill sergeant. Whereupon Martin abruptly realized the intense importance of the present moment. End of chapter 22.
Chapter 23 of The Wonderful Year by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 23. The weary weeks passed by with their alternations of hopes and fears. Martin, insignificant speck of blue and red, was in the Argonne. Sergeant Bigodin of the Armée Territoriale was up in the north. The history of their days is the history of the war which has yet to be written. The story of their personal lives is identical with that of the personal lives of the millions of men who have looked and are looking death always in the face, cut off, as it were, from their own souls by the curtain of war. Things went drearily at the Hôtel des Grottes, but little manhood remained at Brantôme. Women worked in the fields and drove the carts and kept the shops where so few things were sold. Felice busied herself in the fabrique, her staff entirely composed of women. Fortinbras made a pretence of managing the hotel, to which for days together no travellers came. No cars of pleasant motorists were unloaded at its door. Now and then an elderly bagman in vain quest of orders sat in the solitary salle à manger, and Fortinbras waited on him with urbane melancholy. Thrown intimately together, father and daughter grew nearer to each other. They became companions, walking together on idle afternoons and sitting on mild nights on the terrace, with the town twinkling peacefully below them. They talked of many things. Fortinbras drew from the rich store of his wisdom, Felice from her fund of practical knowledge. There were times when she forgot the harrowing mystery of her mother, and, only conscious of a great and yearning sympathy, unlocked her heart and cried a little in close and comforting propinquity. Together they read the letters from the trenches, all too short, all too elusive in their brave cheeriness. The epistles of Martin and Bigodin were singularly alike. Each said much the same. They had not the comforts of the Hôtel Grotte, but what would you have? War was war. They were in splendid health. They had enough to eat. They had had a sharp tussle with the Boche, and many of their men were killed. But victory in the end was certain. In the meanwhile they needed some warm underclothes, as the nights were growing cold, and would Felice enclose some chocolate and packets of bastos. Love to everybody, and Vive la France. These letters Fortinbras would take to the Café de l'Univers and read to the grey-haired remnant of the coterie, each of whom had a precisely similar letter to read. The adjoint de maire was the first to come without a letter. He produced a telegram, which was passed from hand to hand in silence. He had come dry-eyed and brave, but when the telegram reached him, after completing its round, he broke down. "C'est stupide. Forgive me, my friends. I am proud to have given my son to my country. Mais enfin, he was my son, my only son. For the first time I am glad that his mother is no longer living." Then he raised his head valiantly. "Et toi, Vidiot? Lucien, how is he doing?" Then someone heard of the death of Bozo, the young professor at the École Normale. At last, after a long interval of silence, came disastrous news of Bigodin, lying seriously, perhaps mortally wounded, in a hospital in a little northern town. There followed days of anguish. Telegrams elicited the information that he had been shot through the lung. Felice went about her work with a pinched face. In course of time, a letter came from Madame Clotilde Robineau at Chartres. "My dear niece, although your conduct towards me was ungrateful, I am actuated by the teachings of Christianity in extending to you my forgiveness, now that you are alone and unprotected. I hear from a friend of the Abbé Dulop, a venerable priest who is administering to the wounded the consolations of religion, that your uncle Gaspard is condemned to death. Christian duty and family sentiment therefore make it essential that I should offer you a home beneath my roof. You left it in a fit of anger because I spoke of your father in terms of reprobation. But if you had watched by the deathbed of your mother, my poor sister, as I did, in the terrible garret of the Rue Maugrabine, you would not judge me so harshly. Believe me, dear child, I have at heart your welfare, both material and spiritual. If you desire guidance as to the conduct of the hotel, I shall be pleased to aid you with my experience. Your affectionate aunt, Clotilde Robineau. The frigid offer, well meant according to the woman's pale lights, Felice scarcely heeded. Father or no father, uncle or no uncle, protector or no protector, she was capable of conducting a score of hotels. The last thing in the world she needed was the guidance of her Aunt Clotilde. Save for one phrase in the letter, she would have written an immediate, though respectful, refusal, and thought nothing further of the matter. But that one phrase flashed through her brain. Her mother had died in the Rue Maugrabine. They had told her that she had died in hospital. Things hitherto bafflingly dark to her became clear on one awful, tragic hypothesis. She shook with the terror of it. It was the only communication the postman had brought that late afternoon. She stood in the vestibule to read it. Fortinbras, engaged in the bureau over some simple accounts, looked up by chance and saw her staring at the letter with great open eyes, her lips apart, her bosom heaving. He rose swiftly, and hurrying through the side door came to her side. My God, not bad news. She handed him the letter. He read, his mind not grasping at once that which to her was essential. The priests are exaggerating, and as for the proposal... The Rue Maugrabine, said Felice. He drew the quick breath of sudden realization, and for a long time they stood silent, looking into each other's eyes. At last she spoke, deadly white. That woman I saw, who opened the door for me, was my mother. She had pierced to the truth. No subterfuge he could invent had power to veil it. He made a sad gesture of admission. Why did you hide it from me? She asked. You had a beautiful ideal, my child, and it would have been a crime to tear it away. And advanced a step or so toward him, her dark eyes fearless. You know what gave me to understand when I saw her? Yes, my child, said Fortinbras. You also were an ideal? He smiled. You loved me tenderly, but I was not in your calendar of saints, my dear. She mastered herself, swallowing a sob, but the tears rolled down her cheeks. You are now, she said. He laughed uncertainly. A poor old sinner of a saint, he said, and gathered her to him. And later, in the salon, before the fire, for the autumn was damp and cold, he told her the cheerless story of his life, concealing nothing, putting the facts before her so that she could judge. She sat on the rug, her arm about his knee. She felt very tired, as though some part of her had bled to death. But a new wonder filled her heart. In a way she had been prepared for the discovery. In her talks with her uncle and with Martin, she had been keen to mark a strange disingenuousness. She had accused them of conspiracy. They were concealing something. What, she knew not. But a cloud had rested on her mother's memory. If, on that disastrous evening, the frowsy woman of the Rue Maugrabine had revealed herself as her mother, her soul would have received a shock from which recovery might have been difficult. Now the shock had only been mitigated by months of torturing doubt, but was compensated by the thrill of her father's sacrifice. When he had ended, she turned and wept and knelt before him, crying for forgiveness, calling him all manner of foolish names. He said, stroking her dark hair, I'm only a poor old bankrupt Marchand de Bonheur. You will be Marchand de Bonheur to the end, she said, and with total want of logical relevance she added, See what happiness you've brought me tonight. At any rate, my dear, said he, we have found each other at last. She went to bed and lay awake till dawn, looking at a new world of wrongdoing, suffering, and heroism. Who was she, humble little girl, living her sequestered life, to judge men by the superficialities of their known actions? She had judged her father almost to the catastrophe of love. She had judged Martin bitterly. What did she know of the riot in his soul? Now he was offering his life for a splendid ideal. She felt humble beside her conception of him. And her uncle Gaspard, great, tender, adored, was lying far, far away in the north with a bullet through his body. She prayed her valiant little soul out for the two of them. And the next morning she arose and went to her work brave and clear-eyed, with a new hope in God based upon a new faith in man. A day or two later she received a wild letter from Corinna Hastings. Corinna's letters were as frequent as blackberries in March. Felice knitted her brows over it for a long time. Then she took it to her father. "The sense," she said, "must lie in the scrabble I can't make out." Fortinbras put on his spectacles, and when, not without difficulty, he had deciphered it, he took off the spectacles and smiled the benevolent smile of the Marchand de Bonheur. "Leave it to me, my dear," said he. "I will answer Corinna." In the tiny town of Wendlebury, in the noisy bosom of her family, Corinna was eating her heart out. During the latter days of June she had returned to the fold an impecunious failure. As a matter of theory she had upheld the principles of woman suffrage. As a matter of practice, in the effort to obtain it, she loathed it with bitter hatred. She lacked the inspiration of its overwhelming importance in sublunary affairs. She was willing enough to do ordinary work in its interests at a living wage, even to the odious extent of wearing an anemic tricolour and selling newspapers in the streets. But when her duties involve incendiarism, imprisonment, and hunger, striking, Corinna revolted. She had neither conviction nor the courage. Miss Bandage reviled her for a recreant, a snake in the grass, and a spineless doll, and left the flat, forswearing her acquaintance for ever. Headquarters signified disapproval of her pusillanimity. Driven to desperation, she signified her disapproval of headquarters in unmeasured terms. The end came, and prospective starvation drove her home to Wendlebury. When the war broke out, in common with the rest of the young maidenhood of the town, she yearned to do something to help the British Empire. Her sister Clara, to satisfy this laudable craving, promptly married a subaltern, and when he was ordered to the front, went to live with his people. The next youngest sister, Evelyn, anxious for Red Cross work, found herself subsidized by an aunt notoriously inimical to Corinna. Corinna therefore had to throw in her lot with Margaret and Winnie, chits of 15 and 13, the intervening boys having flown from the nest. What was a penniless, and in practical matters a feckless young woman to do? She knitted socks and mufflers and went round the town collecting money for Belgian refugees. So did a score of tabbies, objects of Corinna's scornful raillery, who district visited the poor to exasperation. She demanded work more glorious, more heroic, but lack of funds tied her to detested knitting needles. As the vicar's daughter, she was compelled to go to church and listen to her father's sermons on the war, compared with which infliction, she tartly informed her mother, forcible feeding was a gay amusement. Once or twice she had a postcard from Martin in the Argonne. She cursed herself, her destiny, and her sex. If only she was a man, she would at least have gone forth with a gun on her shoulder. But she was a woman, the most helpless thing in women God ever made. Even her mother, whom she had rated low on account of intellectual shortcomings, she began to envy. At any rate, she had generously performed her woman's duty. She had brought forth 10 children, 5 men children, 2 of whom were rushed to take up arms in defence of their country. Martin's last postcard had told Corinna of Bigoudin being called away to fight. In her enforced isolation from the great events of the great world, she became acutely conscious that in all the great world only one individual had ever found a use for her. A flash of such knowledge either scorches or illuminates the soul. Then, early in November, she received a misspelt letter laboriously written in hard pencil on thin glazed paper. It was addressed from a hospital in the north of France. "Mademoiselle Corinna, I have done my best to strike a blow for my beloved country. It was written that I should do so, and it was written perhaps that I should give my life for her. I am dictating these words to my bedside neighbour who is wounded in the knee. For my part, a German bullet has penetrated my lung, and the doctors say I may not live. But, while I can still speak, I am anxious to tell you that on the battlefield your image has always been before my eyes, and that I always have in my heart a love for you, tender and devoted. Should I live, mademoiselle, I pray you to forget this letter, as I do not wish to cause you pain. But, should I die, let me now have the consolation of believing that I shall have a place in your thoughts as one who has died, not unworthily or unwillingly, in a noble cause. Gaspard-Marie Bigourda. Corinna sat for a long time, frozen to her soul, looking out of her bedroom window at the hopeless autumn drizzle and the sodden leaves on the paths of the vicarage garden. Then, with quivering lips, she sat down at the rickety little desk that had been hers since childhood, and wrote to Bigourda. She sealed it, and went out in the rain, and dropped it in the nearest pillar-box. When she reached her room again, the realization of the inadequacy of her words smote her. She threw herself on her bed and sobbed. After which she wrote her wild letter to Felice. For the next few days a chastened Corinna went about the vicarage. An unusual gentleness manifested itself in her demeanour, and at last emboldened Mrs. Hastings, good, kind soul, to take the unprecedented step of inquiring into her wayward and sharp-tongued daughter's private affairs. "I'm afraid, dearie, that letter you had from France contained bad news." "Yes, mother," said Corinna with a sigh. They were alone in the drawing-room. Mrs. Hastings laid aside her knitting, rose slowly, she was a poorly woman, and went across to Corinna and put her arm about her shoulders. "Can't you tell me what it was, dearie?" she whispered. Corinna melted to the voice. It awakened memories of unutterable comfort of childish years. She surrendered to the embrace. "Yes, mother, the truest man I have ever known, a Frenchman, is dying over there. He asked me to marry him a year ago, and I was a fool, mother. Oh, an awful fool." And half an hour later she said tearfully, "I've been a fool in so many ways. I've misjudged you so, mother. It never occurred to me that you would understand." "My dear," said Mrs. Hastings, stroking her hair, "to bring 10 children into the world and keep them going on small means, to say nothing of looking after a husband, isn't a bad education." The next day came a telegram. "Re-letter Felice. If you want to find yourself at last, go straight to Bigourda. Fortinbras." The message was a lash. She had not contemplated the possibility of going to France. In the sleepless nights she had ached to be with him. But how? In Tierra del Fuego he would be equally inaccessible. Go straight to him. The words were very simple. Of course she would go. Why had she waited for Fortinbras to point out her duty? Then came the humiliating knowledge of impotence. She looked in her purse and counted out her fortune of 13 shillings and 7 halfpenny. A very humble Corinna showed letter and telegram to her mother. "The war seems to have turned everything upside down," said the latter. "You ought to go, dear. It's a sacred duty." "But how can I? I have no money. I can't ask father." "Come upstairs," said Mrs. Hastings. She led the way to her bedroom, and from a locked drawer took an old-fashioned japanned dispatch-box, which she opened. "All my married life," she said, "I've managed to keep something against a rainy day. Take what you want, dear." Thus came the overthrow of all Corinna's scheme of values. She went to France, a woman with a warm and throbbing heart. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of The Wonderful Year by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 24. It was with difficulty that she reached the little French town, and it was with infinitely more difficulty that she overcame military obstacles and penetrated into the poor little whitewashed school that did duty as a hospital. It was a great bare room with a double row of armed bedsteads, a gangway between them. Here and there an ominous screen shut off a bed. A few bandaged men, half-dressed, were sitting up smoking and playing cards. An odour of disinfectant caught her by the throat. A human form lying by the door with but little face visible was moaning piteously. She shrank on the threshold, aghast at this abode of mangled men. The young aide-major escorting her pointed up the ward. "You will find him there, mademoiselle, number 17. "How is she?" she asked. "The day before yesterday he nearly went." He snapped his finger and thumb. "A hemorrhage which we stopped, but the old French stock is solid as oak, mademoiselle. Hole or two doesn't matter. He's going along pretty well." "Thank God," said Corinna. A nurse with Red Cross badge met them. "Ah, it is the lady for Sergeant Bigourdin. He has been expecting you ever since your letter." His eyes were all of him that she recognized at first. His great, hearty face had grown hollow, and the lower part was concealed by a thick black beard. She remembered having heard of les poulous, the hairy ones, as the territorial troops were affectionately termed in France. But his kind, dark eyes were full of gladness. The nurse set a stool for Corinna by the bedside. On her left lay another black-bearded man who looked at her wistfully. He had been Bigourdin's amanuensis. "The angel of tyranny forbids me to move my arms," whispered Bigourdin apologetically. The little whimsical phrase struck the note of the man's unconquerable spirit. Corinna smiled through tears. The nurse said, "Talk to him, and don't let him talk to you. You can only have 10 minutes." She retired. "Cela vous fait beaucoup souffrir, mon pauvre ami," said Corinna. He shook his head. "Not now that you are here. It is wonderful of you to come. You have a heart of gold, and it is that little talisman, ce petit cœur d'or, that is going to make me well. You cannot imagine, it is like a fairy tale to see you here." Instinctively, Corinna put out her hand and touched his lips. She had never done so feminine and tender a thing to a man. She let her fingers remain while he kissed them. She flushed and smiled. "You mustn't talk. It is for me who have sound lungs. I have become because I have been a little imbecile, and only at the 11th hour I have repented of my folly. If I had been sensible a year ago, this would not have happened." He turned happy eyes on her, but he said with his Frenchman's clear logic, "All my love, and all the happiness that might have been, would not have altered the destinies of Europe. I should have been brought here all the same, with a ridiculous little hole through my great body." Corinna admitted the truth of his statement. "But," said she, "I might have been of some comfort to you." His eyebrows expressed the shrug of which his maimed frame was incapable. "It is all for the best. If I had left you at Brantôme, my heart would have been torn in two. I might have been cautious to the detriment of France. As it was, I didn't care much what happened to me. And now they have awarded me the Médaille Militaire, and you are here to make, as Baudelaire says, ma joie et ma santé. What more can a man desire?" Now all this bravery was spoken in a voice so weak that the woman in Corinna was stirred to its depths. She bent over him and whispered, for she knew that the man with the wistful gaze in the next bed was listening. "C'est vrai que tu m'aimes toujours?" She saw her question answered by the quick illumination of his eyes, and she went on quickly, "And I love you too, and I will give you all my poor life for what it is worth. Oh," she cried, "I can't imagine what you can see in me. Beside you I feel so small, of so little account. I can do nothing but love you." "That's everything in the world," said Bigourdin. They were silent for a moment. Then he said, "I should like to meet the Boche who fired that rifle." "So should I," she cried fiercely. "I should like to tear him limb from limb." "I shouldn't," said Bigourdin. "I should like to decorate him with a pair of wings and a little bow and arrow." The nurse came up. "You must go now, mademoiselle. The patient is becoming too excited. It is not your fault. Nothing but a bolster across their mouths will prevent these Perigordins from talking." A tiny bedroom in a house over a grocer's shop was all the accommodation that she had been able to secure, as the town was full of troops billeted on the inhabitants. As it was, that bedroom had been given up to her by a young officer who took pity on her distress. She felt her presence impertinent in this stern atmosphere of war. After seeing Bigourdin, she wandered for a while among the rainy streets, and then retired to her chilly and comfortless room, where she ate her meal of sardines and sausage. The next day she presented herself at the hospital and saw the aide-major. "Can you give me some work to do?" she asked. "I don't pretend to be able to nurse, but I could fetch and carry and do odd jobs." But it was a French hospital, and the règlement made no provision for affording prepossessing young Englishwomen romantic employment. "Of course," said the aide-major, "if mademoiselle was bent upon it, she could write an application which would be forwarded to the proper quarter, but it would have to pass through the bureau," and she, who knew France so well, was aware what the passing through the bureau meant. Unless she had the ear of high personages, it would take weeks, and perhaps months. "And in the meantime," said Corinna, "my grande amie, number 17 down there, will have got well and departed from the hospital." "Mademoiselle," said he, "you have already saved the life of one gallant Frenchman. Don't you think that should give you a sentiment of duty accomplished?" She blushed. He was kind, for he was young and she was pretty. "I can let you see your gros horreur to-day," said he. "It is a favour. It is against the règlement. If the monsieur hears of it, there will be trouble. By the grace of God he has a bilious attack which confines him to his quarters. But, bien entendu, it is for this time only." She thanked him, and again found herself by Bigourdin's bedside. The moment of her first sight of him was the happiest in her life. She had wrought a miracle. He was a different man, inspired with the supreme will to live. The young doctor had spoken truly. A spasm of joy shook her. At last she had been of some use in the world. She saw, too, the Bigourdin whom she had known. His great black beard had vanished. One of the camarades with 2 disposable arms had hunted through the kits of the patients for a razor, and had shaved him. "They tell me I am getting on magnificently," said he. "This morning there is no longer any danger. In a few months I shall be as solid as ever I was. It is happiness that has cured me." They talked. She had told him of her conversation with the aide-major. He reflected for a moment. Then he said, "Do you wish to please me?" "What am I here for?" asked Corinna. "You are here to spoil me. Anyhow, if you wish to please me, go to Brantôme and await me. To know that you are there, chez moi, will give me the courage of 1,000 lions, and you will be able to console my poor Felice, who every night is praying for Martin by the side of her little white bed." And so it was arranged. After 2 days' extraordinary travel, advancing from point to point by any train that happened to run, shunted on sidings for interminable periods, in order to allow the unimpeded progress of military trains, waiting weary hours at night in cold, desolate stations, hungry and broken, but her heart aglow with a new and wonderful happiness, she reached Brantôme. She threw her arms round the neck of an astonished but ever urbane elderly gentleman in the vestibule of the Hôtel des Grottes, and kissed him. "He's getting well," she cried a little hysterically. "He sent me here to wait for him. I'm so happy, and I'm just about dead." "But yet there's that spark of life in you, my dear Corinna," said Fortinbras, "which, according to the saying, distinctly justifies hope. Felice and I will see to it that you live." It was winter before Bigourdin was well enough to return. By that time Corinna had settled down to her new life, wherein she found the making of foie gras an enticing mystery. Also, in a town where every woman had her man, husband, brother, son, or lover, either in hourly peril of death, or dead, or wounded, there was infinite scope for help and consolation. And when a woman said, "Hélas, mon pauvre homme, il est blessé là-bas," she could reply with a new thrilling sympathy and a poignant throb of her heart, And my man too. For like all the other women there, she had son homme, her man. Corinna tasted the fierce joy of being elemental. There was much distress in the little town. The municipality did its best. In many cases the wives valiantly carried on the husband's business. But in the row of cave dwellings where the quarrymen lived, no muscular arms hewed the week's wages from the rocks. Boucabel, Martin's bacchanalian friend, had purged all of his offences in heroic battle and was lying in an unknown grave. Corinna, learning how Martin had carried the child home on his shoulders, brought her to the hotel and cared for her, and obtained work for the mother in the fabrique. Never before had Corinna had days so full. Never before had she awakened in the morning with love in her heart. Felice, grown gentler and happier since the canonization of her father, gave her unstinted affection. And then Bigorre arrived, nominally on sick leave, but with private intimation that his active services would be required no longer. This gave a touch of sadness to his otherwise joyous homecoming. "I have not killed half enough, Boche," said he. A few days after his return came a letter from Martin, and it was written from a hospital. "My dearest Felice, I am well and sound and in perfect health, but a bullet got me in the left arm while we were attacking a German trench, and a spent bit of shrapnel caught me on the head and stunned me. When I recovered I was midway between the trenches in the zone of fire, and I had to lie still between the dead bodies of 2 of our brave soldiers. I thought much, my dear, when I was lying there, expecting every minute a bullet to finish me. And some of what I thought I will tell you when I see you, for I shall see you very soon. After some 36 hours I was collected and brought to the field hospital, where I was patched up, and in the course of a day or so sent on to the base. I lay on straw during the journey in a row of other wounded. France has the defects of her qualities. Her soil is so fertile that her stalks of straw are like young oak saplings. When I arrived I had such a temperature and was so silly with pain that I don't very well remember what happened. When I got sensible, they told me that gangrene had set in and that they had chopped off my arm above the elbow. I always thought I was an incomplete human being, dear, but I've never been so idiotically incomplete as I am now. Although I'm getting along splendidly, I want to do all sorts of things with the fingers that aren't there. I turn to pick up something, and there's nothing to pick it up with. A week before I was wounded, I had a fingernail torn off, and it still hurts me, somewhere in space, about a foot away from what is me. You would laugh if you knew what a nuisance it is. I make no excuses for asking you to receive me at Brantôme. All that is dear to me in the world is there. And what other spot in the wide universe have I to fly to? But sacré nom d'une pipe, cried Bigorre, for Felice, after private and tearful perusal of the letter, was reading such parts of it aloud as were essential for family information. What is the imbecile talking of? Where else indeed should he go? Felice continued. Martin, as yet unaware of Bigorre's return, sent him messages. When you write, will you tell him I have given to France as much of myself as I have been allowed to? Half an arm isn't much. Mais c'est déjà quelque chose. Quelque chose, cried Bigorre, but it is a sacred sacrifice. If I could get hold of that little bit of courageous arm, I would give it to Monsieur le Curé and bid him nail it up as an object venerable and heroic in his parish church. Ah, le pauvre garçon, said he. Mais voyez-vous, it is the English character that comes out in his letter. I have seen many English up there in the north. No longer can we Frenchmen talk of la flamme britannique. The astounding revelation is the unconquerable English gaiety. Jamais de long visage. If a decapitated English head could speak, it would launch you a whimsical smile and say, "What annoys me is that I can't inhale a cigarette." And here our good Martin makes a joke about the straw in the ambulance train. Mon Dieu! I know what it is, but it has never occurred to me to jest about it. In the course of time, Martin returned to Brantôme. The railway system of the country had been fairly adjusted in the parts of France that were distant from scenes of military operations. Bigourdin borrowed Monsieur le Maire's big limousine which had not been commandeered, for the mayor was on many committees in the department, and had to fly about from place to place, and with Corinna and Felice and Fortinbras he met Martin's train at Périgeau. As it steamed in, a hand waved from a window below a familiar face. They rushed to the carriage steps, and in a moment he was among them, in a woolen képi, an incredibly torn blue-grey greatcoat, and ragged red trousers, the unfilled arm of the coat dangling down idly. But it was a bronzed, clear-eyed man who met them, for all his war battering. Bigourdin welcomed him first, in his exuberant way, called him "Mon brave, mon petit héros," and hugged him. Fortinbras gripped his hand after the English manner. Corinna, happy and smiling through glistening eyes, he kissed without more ado. And then he was free to greet Felice, who had remained a pace or two in the background. Her great dark eyes were fixed upon him questioningly. She put out a hand and touched the empty sleeve. She read in his face what she had never read before. His one poor arm stretched in an instinctive curve. With a little sobbing cry she threw herself blindly into his embrace. The tremendous issues of existence with which for 5 months he had been grappling had wiped out from his consciousness, almost from his memory, the first enthralling kiss of another woman. Caked with mud, deafened by the roar of shells, sleeping in the earth of his trench, an intimate of blood and death day after day, he had learned that Lucilla had been but an ignis fatuus, leading him astray from the essential meaning of his life. He knew, as he lay wounded beneath the hell of machine-gun fire between the trenches, that there was only one sweet, steadfast soul in the world who called him to the accomplishment of his being. When, in the abandonment of her joy and grief, his lips met the soft, quivering mouth of Felice, care, like a garment, fell from him. He whispered, "You have a great heart. I've not deserved this. But you're the only thing that matters to me in the world." Felice was content. She knew that the war had swept his soul clean of false gods. Out of that furnace nothing but truth could come. And so Martin returned for ever to the land of his adoption, which on the morrow was to take him after its generous and expansive way as a hero to its bosom. The Englishman who had given a limb for Périgord was to be held in high honour for the rest of his days. He was a man now who had passed through most human experiences, a man of fine honour, of courage tested in 1,000 ways, of stiffened will, of high ideals. The life that lay before him was far dearer than any other he could have chosen. For it matters not so much the life one leads, as the knowledge of the perfect way to live it. And that knowledge, based on wisdom, had Martin achieved. He knew that if the glittering prizes of the earth are locked away behind golden bars opening but to golden keys, there are others far more precious lying to the hand of him who would seek them in the folds of the familiar hills. The 5 sat down to dinner that evening at the empty salle à manger, for not a guest, even the most decrepit commercial traveller, was staying at the hotel. Yet never had they met at a happier meal. Felice cut up Martin's food as though it had been blessed bread. In the middle of it Fortinbras poured out half a glass of wine. "My children," said he, "I am going to break through the habit of years. This old wine of Burgundy is too generous to betray me on an occasion so beautiful and so solemn. I drink to your happiness." "But to whom do Martin and I owe our happiness?" cried Corinna, with a flush on her cheeks and a glistening in her blue eyes. "It is to you, from the first to last, to you, Marchand de Bonheur." "My God, yes," said Martin, extending his one arm to Fortinbras. The ex-dealer in happiness regarded them both benevolently. "For the first time in my life," said he, "I think I have reason to be proud of my late profession. Like the artist who has toiled and struggled, I can, without immodesty, recognize my masterpiece. It was my original conception that Martin and Corinna crude but honest souls should find an incentive to the working out of their destiny by falling in love. Therefore I sent them out together. That they should have an honourable asylum, I sent them to my own kin. When I found they wouldn't fall in love at all, I imagined the present felicitous combination. I have been aided by the little accident of a European war. But what matter? The gods willed it. The gods were on my side. Out of evil there inscrutably and divinely cometh good. My children, my heart is very full of the consolation that at the end of many years that the locust hath eaten, I have perhaps justified my existence. Mon père, cried Felice, all my life long your existence has had the justification of heroic sacrifice. My dear, said he, if I hadn't met adversity with a brave face, I should not have been a man, still less a philosopher. And now that my duty here is over, if I don't go back to Paris and find some means of helping in the great conflict, I shall be unworthy of the name of Englishman. So, as soon as I see you safely and exquisitely married, I shall leave you. I shall, however, come and visit you from time to time. But when I die—" He paused, and fishing out a stump of pencil, scribbled on the back of the menu card. "When I die, bury me in Paris on the south side of the Seine, and put this inscription on my tombstone. One little vanity is accorded by the gods to every human being." He threw the card on the table. On it was written, C.G. Fortinbras, Marchand de Bonheur. When the meal was over, they went up to the prim and plushly furnished salon, where a wood fire was burning gaily. Bigourdin brought up a cobweb bottle of the old brandy of the Brigadier, and uncorked it reverently. "We are going to drink to France," said he. He produced from the cupboard, whose doors were veiled with green-pleated silk, half a dozen of the great glass goblets, and into each he poured a little of the golden liquid, which, as he had once said, contained the soul of the Grande Dame. "Stop a bit," said Martin. "You're making a mistake. There are only 5 of us." "I am making no mistake at all," said Bigourdin. "The 6th glass is for the shade of the brave old Brigadier. If he is not here now among us to honour the toast, I am no Christian man." End of chapter 24. End of The Wonderful Year by William John Locke.